After selling her house in the village, Stacy reluctantly walked to her son's apartment, and when she saw the suitcase. Stacy walked down the street, struggling to move her legs. She had just returned from the supermarket where she had received her pension. The elderly woman went to the nearest grocery store. She needed to buy potatoes, some meat, and she was almost out of cereals. And also milk, flour, sugar. The bag was heavy. It hadn't been a weight for Stacy before, though. On the farm, she'd thrown hay with a pitchfork, carried huge boxes, and carried buckets full of milk or water. What a lot of things she'd done. But now Stacy was a little over 70, and age, of course, was taking its toll. Her back often ached, her arms weakened. She dragged the bag from the supermarket with great difficulty, slowly stopping every now and then to catch her breath. A couple of times she was offered help by passers-by and two teenagers with school backpacks on their shoulders. A middle-aged woman and a tall young guy also offered help. But Stacy refused with a smile. She was in no hurry to get anywhere. And these kind people, it was immediately obvious, were in a hurry to do their own thing. So why distract them? Stacy wasn't just walking so slowly because of the heavy bag. She just didn't want to go home, and the place she was going back to wasn't what you'd call a refuge. Her house used to be spacious, bright, cozy, with a large kitchen and a stove, 4 rooms with a front garden, and a carved fence that Stacy's father had put up, with beloved friends and neighbors. Close to home was good for Stacy, though her work was hard. She spent most of her life working on the collective farm, tending the animals and cleaning the pens. She worked double shifts to make sure her son had everything he needed. She would leave in the dark and return when the sun was already setting over the horizon. Her back ached, her arms and legs buzzed. Still, the old woman remembered those times with nostalgia. She felt much happier then than she did now. The November cold rain fell suddenly, without warning in Philadelphia, as if someone upstairs had opened a faucet of ice water. Stacy was in a hurry. The walk seemed to be canceled. She'd have to go home. There was nowhere to go. The rain was picking up and the wind was picking up. No, we can't run home, we have to wait it out. Stacy hurried to the porch of the nearest store. Here, under the canopy, she could stand until the rain stopped, and then she could go home. On the mischievous tiled plaza, people were gathered, cheerful children, for whom the sudden fall downpour was another adventure, and frowning adults, late for their business because of the rain. Stacy's gaze suddenly fell on a young boy. He stood with his back against the wall, staring blankly at the street. Bright birch eyes, sharply defined cheekbones, hair the color of ripe wheat. A real handsome man. He'd probably get a lot of girls. He looked just like Jacob, a guy Stacy had only known for 2 days in her life. That had been almost 40 years ago. And yet the older woman remembered every feature of the man's face, his scent, and the words he'd said to her. Jacob, if he was still alive, had long since forgotten his casual acquaintance. How many of those had he had? Young girls are attracted to good looks. Jacob has no idea that he has played such a role in the life of one of his many admirers. The key guy, the one Stacy was secretly watching, pulled his cell phone out of his pocket and stared at the screen, occasionally running his finger over the display. Whether he was watching a video or reading something. Young people are so dependent on these gadgets these days. Whether that was good or bad, Stacy didn't know. Her youth was very different. Stacy was born into a family of a tractor driver and a milkmaid. When she was only 2 years old, she became the oldest child. Her parents had another daughter named Vivi. The family lived poorly but decently. They did not starve, did not go in old clothes, and did not go to resorts. They did not buy fur coats and luxury cars. Their parents worked hard, so Stacy and Vivi learned early to help around the house. Stacy, observing modern children whom she thought were overprotective of their parents, marveled. She and her sister, at 7 or 8 years old, could already mop the floors, cook lunch and dinner. Moreover, the girls cleaned the yard, took care of the livestock, did their own homework and laundry without reminders. And after all, they did not have modern technical wonders that make life much easier: washing machines, dishwashers, and so on. The girls still had a lot of free time. Having coped with the lessons and finished their homework, the sisters with a clear conscience went to the street to their friends. All their peers lived the same way. They had time to do housework and at school and play with their classmates. Stacy and Vivi were always very friendly, supporting each other. Stacy has the fondest memories of her childhood. Then everything was simple, clear and easy. The future was seen in bright colors. Stacy didn't do well in school. Unlike her little sister, Vivi was a quick learner. Complex formulas were no problem for her. The complex rules of the Russian language seemed to fall into place in her younger sister's head. For Stacy, however, science remained incomprehensible throughout her schooling. She seemed to be trying to learn literacy. She always did her homework. She was not lazy. She did not slack off. But apparently the ability was not given. Vivi understood everything effortlessly. She just had a clear head. Parents were proud of their youngest daughter. Maybe someone from the family will get a higher education, dreamed the mother to get into the people. Daughter, reasoned the father, you have a head on your shoulders. It's foolish to miss such a chance. You do your best, and we'll help you. Stacy was proud of her sister too, but it hurt her to hear her parents say that. It turned out that her parents really hoped more for Vivi and expected her to succeed in her studies and career. They didn't count on Stacy for that. Vivi tried hard, studied hard, and never bullied her sister. On the contrary, she helped Stacy with her lessons. When Stacy was faced with assignments that were difficult for her, the sisters grew up. Stacy went to study in the city, went to college, choosing a specialty of sewing technologist. The girl has always had an aptitude for needlework. She realized that she would become a good tailor. Wright approved the choice of the eldest daughter's father. The specialty is wonderful. You will not be left without a piece of bread. You have golden hands. Agreed the mother. Bon voyage. After her studies, Stacy decided to stay in the city. She got a job in an atelier, rented an apartment nearby, started taking part-time jobs, and soon Stacy was supporting herself. The atelier paid a small salary, but the part-time jobs helped to make a dress, a coat, a tablecloth, or something else. Stacy did not sit without work and money. Meanwhile, Vivi was studying law at university. How proud her parents were of her success and told their acquaintances about it. For the eldest daughter, they were calm, hard-working. Stacy will not be lost. But they were really proud of their youngest daughter, Vivi, who was smart and beautiful, and was also studying at university. Stacy was genuinely happy for her sister. What could she do? She herself was not given to gnaw on the granite of science, but she had golden hands, and it was noted by everyone. As time went on, Stacy's friends were getting married, but it didn't seem to be working out for her. She wasn't attracted to the guys she liked, and for some reason the guys Stacy liked preferred other girls. When she heard about her friends' and classmates' weddings, Stacy worried that she might end up alone, an old maid. Her parents only added fuel to the fire, asking each time their eldest daughter arrived, when will she get married? When children? When will you settle down? Vivi's parents were in no hurry to get married. For one thing, she was the youngest daughter. As long as her older sister didn't get married, Vivi didn't have to worry about it. Secondly, she was still in school, and after graduation she was going to go to graduate school. Her parents saw her in their dreams as a university teacher or even a professor. From the eldest, Stacy, they just expected human happiness, to meet a cheerful, good-natured husband, to have favorite grandchildren. Stacy was almost desperate. She looked at every guy in her neighborhood as a potential spouse and evaluated young people only from this position. Of course, such obsession did not go unnoticed and scared men away. Once there was a dance at the House of Culture. Stacy went there with her friends. She didn't like dancing very much, and loud music gave her a headache. But you could meet someone at the dance. Galia, her friend, found a husband there. They were living together now, expecting their first child. Stacy wanted the same, the love of a husband, a child, simple human happiness. She put on her best dress, tight, short, revealing her slender legs, curled her hair into curls, painted her eyelashes and lips. After looking at herself in the mirror and being satisfied, she slipped out of the house. Stacy didn't have much hope for anything, because she went to the dance once every 2 or 3 months and always came back with nothing. But that night was different, magical, amazing. Jacob had noticed one of Stacy's friends, Penelope, a blue-eyed beauty. He approached their company, seemed to be getting to know everyone, but kept his eyes on Penelope. Stacy realized she was missing. When she saw the stranger's turquoise eyes, merry, mischievous, and sly, and his smile that would drive anyone crazy, she fell in love. Jacob was witty and fun to talk to. He felt confident, not embarrassed, unlike so many of the other guys in Stacy's company. And she herself, of course, was mesmerized by him. Stacy envied Penelope. She wished that this young man was looking so interested in her and not her friend. She would have given a lot for that. But Jacob asked Penelope one dance, then another. Stacy watched them enviously from a distance. She saw the boy try several times to hold Penelope tighter to him than was proper. His hands kept slipping below her waist. Penelope, embarrassed, tried to pull away. Stacy didn't understand her. What was all this modesty and childish behavior? They were adults. They had already graduated. They were working. After another dance, Penelope slipped outside for some fresh air. Stacy understood that. She had been frightened by her beau's pressure, so she'd found an excuse to run away. Stacy had been watching the couple all evening and could see what was going on. Jacob hurried after his lady, but Stacy got in his way. Slow music was playing. "Shall we dance?" Stacy smiled at the boy. It was a desperate and bold move. Stacy had never acted like this before. But now it was as if someone was leading her by the hand. The girl suddenly felt relaxed, confident. There was no doubt in her mind that Jacob would agree to dance with her. And so he did. He stared at Stacy for a moment, as if trying to remember who she was. But of course, Jacob had only been looking at Penelope when he met her. He didn't care about the others. But the next second, he was smiling radiantly at Stacy, making her heart race and her palms sweat. And he held out his hand to her. They danced in each other's arms. Stacy melted in his warm embrace. When the music stopped, he even kissed the girl. Of course, it wasn't the first kiss in Stacy's life, but she had never had that reaction before. Stacy felt dizzy and her eyes darkened. She wished Jacob could hold her like this for the rest of her life. She didn't care if he kissed and hugged her in front of everyone. Let them watch, let them be jealous. And she didn't care what or who thought of her. "Why don't we go for a walk?" Jacob suggested in a slightly husky voice. Stacy was all for it. She wanted to be alone with him too. They walked through the city at night, holding hands. Jacob said something about himself, then asked Stacy questions about her life. When he learned that she lived alone, he offered to go to her. Stacy agreed without hesitation. In the evening and at night, Stacy played a very pleasant role for herself. She imagined that she and Jacob were husband and wife who loved each other and were going to live together for the rest of their lives. It was a pleasure to be near this man, to take care of him. How happy was it to fall asleep next to the one she loved? Jacob was already asleep, but Stacy lay there, staring at the ceiling, savoring the warmth of a loved one. His peaceful breathing, the silence, the stillness. Just the two of them. Magical. Stacy realized she was in love like she had never been in her life. She never knew she was capable of such feelings. Stacy didn't know much about Jacob. He told her he lived in another city. Which city, he didn't mention. He'd tell her tomorrow. Guy came here to visit a friend. They were in the army together. This coworker had a wedding recently. So he invited Jacob. Witnesses like Jacob's leaving soon. But now everything's changed. They've met each other. Jacob isn't going anywhere, and if he does, he'll probably take her with him. The way he'd been looking at her all night. Those looks were the spark that had ignited between them, and that rarely happens. How lucky they were to meet each other at the dance. In the morning, Stacy woke up to someone rattling pans in the kitchen, but caught the scent of scrambled eggs. Stacy stretched in bed and smiled, remembering the events of the previous evening. It's Jacob. He's making them breakfast. How wonderful and romantic this is. Before meeting her lover, Stacy peeked into the bathroom. She washed her face, lightly brushed her hair to look casual, touched up her lipstick and lightly pinched her cheeks, causing a blush. She wanted to look her best in front of Jacob. He'd made her scrambled eggs, and there was ham frying in the skillet. "Good morning," he smiled. "I've been tending to your place for a while. Nothing, I was just hungry." "It's for the best." Stacy smiled radiantly. Breakfast, almost in bed. How romantic. "Why don't you come on? I'll take care of you." Jacob took out a plate, deftly placed a piece of scrambled egg on it, and sprinkled greens on top. Stacy watched his every move as if mesmerized. Her heart beat joyfully in her chest. She had finally met her man. And what a man. beautiful, intelligent, attentive, caring. They ate breakfast in silence. Jacob seemed pensive. He was obviously thinking about something, and Stacy didn't want to distract him. "Thank you for tonight," he finally broke the silence. "I have to go. I have to stop by Layton's, pack my things, and get to the train station. The train's coming." Stacy felt like she'd been hit over the head with a sandbag. How come? Is he leaving already? What about her? I mean, they're so happy, so cozy together. "Are you leaving already?" she asked in a distressed voice. "Didn't I tell you?" Jacob was surprised. Then he smiled his charming smile. "Yeah, well, we didn't have much to talk about last night." "I thought you were staying," Stacy admitted. "I would have." "You're great, aren't you? But the train's in 3 hours and there's a lot to do. We'll see each other again." Stacy struggled to keep the tears from coming to her eyes. She'd already figured it out from Jacob's look and his tone. It was an illusion, their feelings and sparks. The situation that Stacy and Jacob found themselves in was fairly typical and common. They obviously had different expectations for this encounter. For Jacob, it was an easy one-night adventure with no commitment. He was honest and didn't intentionally deceive Stacy. He just didn't specify all the details because of the romantic atmosphere. On the other hand, Stacy fell in love very quickly and began to build illusions about a serious relationship and a future together. She herself invented a beautiful love story, although Jacob did not promise anything like that. When the truth came out, it was a painful disappointment for Stacy. But she'd done the right thing, not to make a scene, but to keep her dignity. Jacob had been good in his own way too, apologizing, explaining the situation, and not making empty promises. In this kind of casual romance, it is important to be sober about the situation and the expectations of both parties. Avoid naive illusions and do not build air castles. But if feelings have awakened, do not be ashamed of them or suppress them. The main thing is to maintain respect for yourself and your partner. Accept the situation as it is. Extract from it a positive experience, not bitterness of resentment. Life goes on, and new love adventures and meetings may be waiting ahead. The situation Stacy finds herself in is indeed a difficult one. An unexpected pregnancy after a casual liaison puts before her a difficult choice, on which her whole future life depends. On the one hand, she dreams of motherhood, and at her age this may be her last chance to have a child, plus a child from a man for whom she had warm feelings. Igor has shown himself to be an attentive and caring man, albeit for a short time. On the other hand, Jacob is clearly not expecting and not ready for fatherhood after a fleeting affair. Raising a child alone will be very difficult, both morally and financially, and the pregnancy itself in her position a great stress. To make a decision on abortion is also not easy. In addition to ethical worries, it can negatively affect health and further fertility. In such a situation, it is very important to soberly consider all options, listen to your heart, but also objectively assess your strength and capabilities. Consult with close people who can support. And having made a decision, do not torture yourself with doubts and guilt. No matter how difficult the situation may be, life goes on. Perhaps in the future Stacy will have the opportunity to become a mother under more favorable circumstances. Or maybe this experience will help her better understand her true desires and priorities. The main thing is to move forward, drawing strength from her informed choices. Stacy had never met one before at all. She couldn't think of a better candidate for fatherhood. No, of course, Jacob won't be involved in the baby's life. He wouldn't even know he existed. No way. They'll never meet again. And yet, such a heredity. If the baby turns out to be as beautiful, it's a dream come true. Stacy felt she couldn't get rid of the baby, even with the hardships that threatened her. The fate of a single mother is unenviable, but it's better than being all alone. Having no children at all is even worse. In general, Stacy hesitated for a while and then made a difficult decision for herself. She leaves the child and will try her best to give the baby a good childhood. She has a profession. Parents, in case of anything, will definitely help. They are loving, reliable. So the baby will be. The decision has been made. Stacy felt inner peace and began, at last, to really enjoy the life, rapidly developing under her heart. At this time, Vivi, the younger sister, had finished graduate school and received her degree. Not only that, she was invited to work overseas for a large company doing research. This was something incredible in Stacy's eyes. Vivi, her little sister, had made it to such heights. A dizzying career, interesting work, recognition awaited her. And she, Stacy, would soon be a single mom. Her parents talked of their youngest daughter's impending departure. They were proud of her, proud of Vivi again, and had no idea that their eldest daughter would soon make them happy that she was about to become a single mom. Against the backdrop of her sister's success, for which Stacy was certainly very happy, her own life seemed a complete failure. Vivi drove away. She called her parents and sister, occasionally sending letters with pictures in them. Vivi had changed. There was a hardness in her face that made the girl even more beautiful and attractive. Beautiful, smart, just a dream. And Stacy had her own life going on. A few months passed, and it was impossible to hide the pregnancy. At work, they figured it out. The boss wasn't particularly happy that one of his seamstresses was going on maternity leave. Now he was nagging Stacy about her work and kept insinuating that she wouldn't be welcome at work because a single mom would be taking sick leave all the time. Who would have to work then? All of this was unsettling to Stacy. She understood that the case is going to be dismissed because the labor code carefully protects pregnant employees. But there are always loopholes, so the boss found one. One day he simply closed the attire, terminating its existence. Accordingly, all female employees lost their jobs, but only for one day, because the firm went bankrupt only on paper. In fact, it continued to function without stopping. The very next day, the boss took the dressmakers back to their old jobs. All except Stacy. A pregnant employee and then a single mom with a small child were of no use to the boss. Stacy was out of work and destitute. She had no savings. She couldn't even pay her rent. Nowhere to go. Stacy had to go back to her parents in the village and confess everything to them. Her mother and father were surprised to hear her daughter's story, but not particularly upset, even seemingly on the contrary. "Do not worry, we'll get through," her father soothed, stroking Stacy's head like a little girl. "We won't fall through. It's not those times. We'll be fine," echoed the mother. "You have a baby, we'll help raise it. Children are happiness." Her parents didn't seem bothered by the difficulties ahead or the inevitable gossip from the neighbors. Stacy understood why this was the case. They had a successful youngest daughter. Even Stacy's life mistakes paled in comparison to Vivi's accomplishments. On the one hand, it made life easier for the mother to be, but on the other hand, it made her feel even more ridiculous and stupid. As always, against Vivi's background, Stacy was losing badly. Frustrating, painful, but familiar. At the due date, Stacy's son Ben was born. The new mother spent hours looking at his red, wrinkled face, trying to see if he looked like Jacob. She wanted him to look like his father, to be as handsome, as charming, as charismatic. It didn't work. Ben didn't have those deep birch eyes or the open smile that made his cheeks dimple. Ben was just an ordinary boy, short, skinny, black-haired, like his grandfather. Stacy was a little hurt that her son hadn't inherited his father's good looks, but it didn't affect her feelings for the little boy in any way. Stacy adored Ben. The first time she saw her baby, she realized that from now on all her actions, all her life would be only for his sake, for the sake of this little man. While Ben was a baby, Stacy was supported by her parents. How could they not? Government payments are minimal, no husband, no savings, no job in sight. Who wants an employee with a baby in her arms? So the parents fed both their daughter and their adored grandchild. Stacy didn't want to be on their backs, so as soon as the opportunity arose, she took a job as a farm laborer. Ben was too young for kindergarten. He was left in the care of his grandparents. They were very fond of him. But Stacy decided to work. After all, her baby needed the best toys, the best clothes, the best travel. She accepted that Ben was growing up without a father, but the boy should not be in need because of his own mother's carelessness. The work was hard and physically exhausting. To make a good living, she had to work double shifts, but at least Stacy had money. Now she went into town with Ben every weekend. They sat in cafes, went on rides, went to the movies, and of course visited toy stores. Stacy often let her son choose what he wanted: expensive radio-controlled cars, imported construction equipment, huge sets of soldiers. Stacy literally bent over backwards at work for this, but most importantly, the happy gleam in her only child's eyes. "Why do you shake your head sometimes?" Dad asked. "You can't do that. Everything is for Ben. You forget about yourself. And you're still young." "I don't want anything," Stacy shrugged. "I just want my son to be happy." "Son, it's time you taught him to work," teased his father. "He doesn't clean up his plate or his room." The grandmother objected. "You do everything for him." "Spoiled the boy. It's not good for him. It's not good for a man." No, Stacy's mother intervened. "A loving grandmother will still have time to teach him to work. Let him enjoy his childhood for now." Stacy fully shared her mother's opinion and supported her. Her father just waved his hand at the women's arguments and silently went outside. Sometimes he would say something like, "Can't you argue with me?" Stacy was annoyed by her father's behavior at the time. It wasn't until a decade later that she realized how right he was. Blinded by her love for her only son, Stacy hadn't seen or noticed much. Now they're reaping the rewards. Ben grew up a bright but lazy boy. At school, he'd grasped everything quickly at first and was an excellent student without much difficulty. Stacy hoped he'd taken after his Aunt Vivi. She already held a position in the Scientific Academy, published in journals, and was almost a celebrity, at least in scientific circles. But it is impossible to ride out all the school years on one cleverness and memory. It was time to work, to teach, to delve into complex formulas, to make an effort. That's what Ben didn't want to do. And the problems began: twos, absences, unwillingness to go to this stupid school at all. Ben gave a lot of arguments for the fact that in the modern world a person can get a good job without education. And Stacy's heart was bleeding from the fact that her son was wasting his abilities in such a stupid and talentless way. The strict grandfather tried to educate his stubborn grandson. This time the mother and grandmother did not interfere with him, kept aside. But it was too late. For Ben, there were no more authorities. The boy got mixed up with a bad bunch of teenagers from dysfunctional families. Stacy talked to her son a lot, tried to call him to order, but it was all in vain. Ben was convinced that he knew best how to behave. "But what can you teach me?" he questioned his mother. "You live in poverty. You have no education. All your life you worked on the farm for pennies. Your parents should have brought you up." By example, you know. "I don't want a life like yours," Ben said to Stacy's mother. "Your example wasn't a good one. There are other ways." Stacy had nothing to say to her rapidly growing son. All she could do was hope that he would be all right, that he would grow up and wise up. The year Ben was to graduate from high school, Stacy experienced many losses. First, just after New Year's Eve, her father passed away. He'd long had a strange cough and difficulty breathing, but he'd written it off as a lifelong smoker. It turned out to be his heart. The heart attack happened in the morning. The ambulance didn't even make it to the hospital. After his grandfather's death, Ben went wild. The man, though elderly, had kept him in check. Now it's like he's got no brakes. He could disappear nights with new friends, come home drunk and demand money from his mother and grandmother for entertainment. Ben became rude, abrasive, a total stranger. Neither persuasion nor threats worked on him. Stacy, who was still longing for her father, felt she was losing her son. And only his mother gave her hope with her words that the boy was mad because he was growing up at that age, without a father. "The boy is difficult, nothing to him. He will soon calm down." "I have seen a lot of such cases in my life," said the grandmother. And indeed, by the middle of the year, Ben had suddenly grown up sharply. He had just graduated from high school, had received his certificate with C's, and he had received his grades only for his past merits, and that was thanks to his mother, who at the end of the year ran after the teachers and the school administration with gifts. Ben seemed to appreciate that his mother and grandmother had done a lot for him, and even apologized to them. Stacy's heart sang with joy. Mom had been right. Growing up, Ben changed. "I decided to go to City College to be a welder. It's a great trade," he announced. His mother and grandmother approved of his choice. They would have been happy with any decision Ben made. The main thing was that the boy realized the importance of education. Ben would learn, he would get a profession, he would have a good, settled life. He left without difficulty, went to college, started an independent life in a college dormitory. Stacy breathed a sigh of relief. Everything seemed to be falling into place. and then another blow hit. On New Year's Eve, the elderly Vivi fell ill. Fever, cough. No big deal, just the usual seasonal cold. Stacy nursed her back to health, but her grandmother got worse and worse. They called the doctor. He immediately heard wheezing in her lungs. Vivi was admitted to the hospital with a diagnosis of bilateral pneumonia. Stacy was scared, of course, but pneumonia is a serious thing. Only Grandma is in the hospital, under the care of doctors. Stacy didn't think anything bad, but one morning she got a call from the hospital with the terrible news that Vivi was gone. During the night, the seizures began. In just 1 year, Stacy had lost both parents, her support, her reliable rear end. It seemed to her that she had been knocked out from under her feet. She was left alone with this cruel world, with a complicated life and a difficult teenager, Ben. How she wished now that Jacob, the father of her child, was there. Yes, she still remembered him fondly and lovingly. Stacy needed a solid shoulder to lean on in this difficult situation. But there was no such person, there just wasn't. Vivi was far away. Sure, she would come for a while to say goodbye to her mom. But she'd go straight back to her vibrant, eventful life. And Jacob, of course, wouldn't remember Stacy anymore. I wonder how his life turned out. Surely he is happily married, raising his children, not even realizing that somewhere there is another son, so in need of attention and care. Time passed. Stacy was adjusting to her new life. The son went to study in the city. The woman still worked double shifts to make sure Ben had everything he needed. Ben needed clothes, food, textbooks, and extra classes. The young man still needed to go out and have fun after all. It is the time of college, when, if not now. And life in the city is not cheap. Her son wasn't working yet, so Stacy did her best for her only child, bending her back and transferring most of her paycheck to Ben. Doesn't she need much? But for Ben, whose life was just beginning, Stacy wanted to provide everything he needed. If you brought a man into this world, you'd better provide for him. It was oddly dreary to be in an empty house. No one to discuss the news of the day with. Ben, of course, was called almost every night. He answered his mother's questions that he was fine, always in a hurry. It was understandable, being young. Stacy took no offense, but she often felt lonely and abandoned. Edward, a former classmate who was already a widower, began courting Stacy during this period of her life. He worked as a driver for the administration. Once upon a time, Edward had chased Stacy with flowers and compliments. It was back in high school. Funny, Stacy recalled, insecure, ridiculous, kind of anxious, but touching. Back then, young Stacy had dreamed of guys like Jacob, handsome, stylish, smart. And Edward, he was too plain, ethereal, puny, and wearing glasses. Of course, Stacy was pleased by the boy's attention. It flattered her ego, to be sure. But anything serious with him was out of the question. Time passed. Edward had grown from a teenager into a rather attractive man. He married a girl a grade below him, Trixie, whom Stacy had been friends with as a child. They weren't close friends, but they often hung out together, talking, sharing secrets. Edward and Trixie's family was exemplary. They were both quiet, hardworking, polite. It was hard to imagine either of them raising their voices at their spouse or children. Stacy was happy for her childhood friends. Edward and Trixie had a son and a daughter. They raised their children, worked, flew to the sea every summer. Full house, affluence, love, prosperity. Stacy looked at this happy couple with a smile, and was happy for them, and a little envious. That was the kind of family she wanted to have, preferably with Jacob. But it hadn't worked out. Except that Edward and Trixie's happiness had been short-lived. Young and seemingly healthy Trixie suddenly began to wither. She was literally melting away. She became thin, weak. Edward took his wife to hospitals trying to help her. The cause, of course, was found some complex genetic disease had debuted. But the doctors just threw up their hands and gave disappointing prognoses. There was no help. As a result, Edward was left alone with 2 children in his arms. True, his son and daughter were already old enough, but still the whole village supported the inconsolable widower. Stacy even cooked dinners for the orphan family. And then the man pulled himself together and took care of the household himself. So slowly he raised the children, put them on their feet, educated them. Both of them were already working and living in the city. Edward was in no hurry to move closer to his children. His elderly parents were still in the village. so he looked after them. When Ben left for school, Stacy began to notice that Edward was around more and more often, walking her home after work, chatting about this and that, or helping her carry her bags from the store. It was as if he was accidentally in her way. Stacy didn't mind this pleasant company. They talked about the news, reminisced about their childhood, laughed. One day she invited Edward to tea. He met her after work, as was his custom, and walked her to the gate. The man agreed and came in. Finally, Edward decided to have a serious conversation. It was obvious that he was not taking this step lightly. "Stacy, I've always liked you, you know," he said. "Well, when was that?" Stacy smiled. She hadn't realized what Edward was getting at then. It seemed to her that they were just reminiscing about their childhood again. It had been a long time ago, hadn't it? Edward agreed. Then he looked at her seriously and added, but nothing had changed since then. Stacy looked at the man questioningly. She didn't know what to say. But the sensation of this unexpected confession was clearly pleasant. It sent shivers down her spine and warmed her heart. "I've had a crush on you since I was a kid." Since the 6th grade, Edward continued. "I decided to admit it in high school. And then I backed off. I pretended I didn't care, but I didn't, and I didn't. And the truth is, I was in a lot of pain. I used to sneak looks at you, admire you. I'd get jealous if any of the guys were around. And I dreamed that when I graduated from high school, I'd get rich and come after you in a cool car. Then you'd pay attention to me." Stacy smiled. The confession seemed naive and sweet. She hadn't noticed anything. Edward smiled too, remembering his young, ambitious self. "But it didn't work out," the man continued. "I couldn't get into university. I didn't have enough brains. I studied to be a driver and returned to the village. Of course, I found out about you. Some acquaintances told me you lived in the city. They said you had someone. Well, I didn't doubt it. Such a beauty. How could you not have fans lining up? I bet they did." Stacy couldn't take it anymore and laughed out loud. "Edward, living here in the village, thought I was a horde of suitors. I was lonely and jealous of my married friends. Oh, you don't know how wrong you were." "Yes, I was a young fool." Edward grinned. "Anyway, I decided that the train had finally left." "Edward, you were under the illusion that I had a rich fiancé in town and tons of admirers. In reality, I was lonely and jealous of my married friends." "You're in town, and you have a rich fiancé who lavishes you with gifts," Edward said bitterly. "I should have checked, and I suffered and felt my own inadequacy. Who was I? Just a driver. And you're a princess? A queen, an unattainable ideal. No match for me." Edward was in almost physical pain at the time. The girl he had been in love with since childhood would never be his. At the time, it seemed like there was nothing to live for. The guy worked and ate, went out with friends. The world was somehow gray and faded. Everything seemed meaningless. And then it suddenly became clear that the neighbor's daughter Trixie was attracted to him, to Edward. It was an amazing discovery for the boy. Someone could love him for who he was, not too pretty, not too successful. Anya had gone from a skinny girl to a lovely young woman. Big clear eyes, thick long hair, thin waist. Trixie graduated from a teacher's college in the city and returned to her hometown. She was now teaching school, tutoring first graders. She walked briskly toward Edward that evening, returning from work. She caught up with her neighbor at the gate and told him to his face how she felt. "I was stunned," Edward recalled with a smile. "It was unexpected, and I felt sorry for her. I'd been in the same position myself. I knew how hopeful she was, how important my attention was to her. And I knew how much my indifference would throw her off. How could I do that to a fragile girl in love?" Anyway, Edward and Trixie started dating, getting to know each other better and realizing every day that they were a great couple. "I thought nothing good was going to happen in my life," Edward said. "It was as if Trixie had pulled me out of my cocoon, showing me that happiness was still possible." Edward and Trixie married and had children. "And then? Then you came back to the village," confused and pregnant Edward said to Stacy. "How I wanted to be there for you, to support you. but it was too late. We were married, and we had babies. Did you still love me then? Stacy wondered. Of course I did, Edward answered. I still do. But I couldn't show my feelings then. I already had obligations to Trixie and the children. I loved all three of them very much, and I couldn't betray my family, not even for my own happiness. Were you unhappy? Stacy asked in surprise. Edward's revelations had shaken her to the core. I couldn't say. Trixie was wonderful. I loved her in my own way, took care of her. I was good to her. But with you, even now, I can't describe how I felt and how I feel. They sat for a while longer. Edward stared at Stacy, waiting for some sign from her. She didn't understand her own feelings. She was pleased that there was someone who loved her so much. It made her feel warm. After the death of her parents, Stacy was left all alone, a son in town, a sister abroad. There were no people who cared about her, who tried to please her, who were interested in her well-being. And then there was Edward. In love, devoted, good, reliable. But something was stopping Stacy, Ben. How would he feel about this turn of events? He'd probably disapprove, say her mother had gone crazy and was having an affair in her old age. Only the desire to be with someone she cared about gradually overcame her doubts. Stacy often thought about how nice it would be if they lived together. Edward would be happy, that was for sure. And it felt good to know that you could make someone so happy. Anyway, that night, the former classmates decided to try to become a couple. I'll ask you out tomorrow, Edward summarized with a smile. The dream of my youth would finally come true. It will come true. Stacy nodded like Trixie's wife. The next day they went into town. They wandered through the park, talking, sitting in cafes, and then they went to a movie theater. Edward took Stacy's hand during the movie and held it for an hour and a half until the movie was over. The woman didn't mind, she liked the feeling. She was finally not alone. A week later, Edward moved in with her. He fixed the leaky faucet and tightened the hinges on all the interior doors. They were finally squeak-free. And Stacy started cooking for herself again. She was too lazy to do it alone, but now Edward was with her, and she was making him happy with delicious meals. The only question on Stacy's mind was how Ben would feel about all this. He didn't know yet, did he? His son rarely came to visit his mother, and they talked on the phone more and more. She had been stalling, not telling Ben about the changes in her life. Edward had told both his son and daughter at once. Stacy realized they were happy for their father. She wished her own son would react the same way, but there was little hope of that. Several years passed. Stacy still hadn't decided to have a serious conversation with her son. Hiding the details of her personal life wasn't difficult. The son had little interest in what was going on with his mother. He usually only called to ask for money. But one day, Ben came to visit. It was surprising. The son hadn't graced his mother with his presence for a long time, and now he showed up. Hi, Stacy was both excited and a little confused. Edward hadn't come home from work yet, but his things were everywhere. It was impossible to ignore the fact that someone else was living in the house now. Hi, Ben said glumly. He didn't look well, gaunt, pale, anxious. I need money, he said. Stacy knew right away that something serious had happened. What's going on? She asked, clutching at her heart. Something stabbed in her chest. Is it something with school? I haven't studied in a long time, Ben muttered under his breath. How come? They expelled me for truancy. I've been working hard and you don't get any money, he said rudely. I sent you most of your paycheck every month, Stacy reminded him. That's good money for the city. It's nothing, Ben sighed. I didn't have enough. So I did the best I could. Other people's parents are well-to-do. They have cars and apartments and money for fun. Did I feel like a beggar all the time? You think that's nice? It hurt Stacy to hear those words. She'd worked her whole life for her son. She wanted Ben to have the best of everything. And now this is what happens. He thinks he's miserable. So Stacy's not doing her job as a parent. Ben even dropped out of college. So what now? Stacy asked. Did he go into debt? I wanted to start a business, make some money, Ben explained. I ended up in debt. They're charging me a lot of money. They're threatening to kill me. Where am I going to get it? So I came to you for help, Mom. You know I ain't got nothing. What do you mean you don't have anything? Ben was surprised. What about the house? Do you want us to sell the house? Well, what's the solution, Mom? I'll pay off my debts and rent an apartment. We'll live in the city. Why are you going to take a well-deserved vacation soon? There's no couch in town, of course. But I'll get you a job in an attire. My grandmother told me that you used to be a seamstress, and now this labor pays well. We'll live together in town, like we used to. Wouldn't that be nice? Stacy couldn't agree with her son. A couple of years ago, she would have happily supported Ben's idea. Living alone in an empty house was unbearable. But now she had Edward. They were good together. It was nice to have someone who loved and understood. And now what? Ben finally noticed the men's things in the rooms. Edward's jacket hung on the wall, his pants were on the table. There were size 43 sneakers by the front door. What are those? Ben asked, looking at his mother in amazement. Did you have someone in your life? I've been wanting to tell you for a long time, Stacy said. It's just something that happened here. Ben nodded his head understandingly and sighed sadly. My personal life is getting better. Yeah, well, of course you don't have a son to worry about. You know I'm not. Stacy objected softly. She could see that Ben was depressed and in trouble. He needed help, and she, the mother, would certainly lend him her shoulder in his time of need. Who else would? Son, I'll do whatever you say. And Stacy did. She sold the house, gave most of the proceeds to her son. With the rest, she bought a tiny apartment in an old house on the outskirts of Los Angeles. Edward offered options, wanted to give Ben his savings. It was less than he needed, but it was still a decent amount. Stacy didn't agree. Edward shouldn't have to solve her problems. Their problems. He had children of his own. Using a man in a situation like this is despicable. Stay with me, Edward asked Stacy. You're packed, your suitcases are waiting for tomorrow morning. Ben has ordered a cab for you by 10 o'clock. You know I can't, Stacy replied. I know, but I don't understand. You gave him money, you bought him a place to live. But why would you want to be there yourself? Stay with me. I've got a big house, plenty of room, you know. We had a good time together, didn't we? We were, agreed Stacy. Yes, in the few years she'd lived with Edward, the woman had grown accustomed to warmth, to caring, to understanding. It was very pleasant. They walked together in the evenings, discussing things. Edward looked at Stacy with loving eyes, and she felt happy. But now everything was different. Stacy could see that her son was not well. Too anxious, too restless. Something bad is clearly going on in his life. Yes, Ben is an adult, and Edward is partly right when he says he should be able to deal with his own problems. But when Stacy was in a difficult situation, she didn't deal with her problems on her own. Stacy's parents had helped her a lot in the past. Edward assured her that this was a different story. A young, single woman with a baby in her arms and a grown man who'd been given money from the sale of her house by her mother. Stacy couldn't agree with him. It's fine for him to talk. He's got both his son and his daughter graduated, working good jobs, with families. There was no telling how Edward would behave if one of his children was in a situation like Ben's. Stacy was also afraid of losing her last place to live. Now that she didn't have the house she'd spent her childhood in, she was beginning to worry about growing old. It wouldn't be long before she would be elderly and possibly helpless. What would she do without a corner of her own if Ben could not be looked after? He's going to lose that apartment in the old building too. And we need to find out what's going on in his life. Maybe we should save his son. It's about time. He's not going to admit it himself. But when they start living together, Stacy will realize it, see it for herself. She can't leave her only child alone with his troubles and problems. Why are you so worried? Stacy smiled at Edward. It was a sad smile. The woman understood, even without the mirror. I'm not moving to the moon or even to another continent. The city's close by. Distance is no barrier to feelings. Shall we meet, socialize? Of course, Edward sighed. But it's not the same thing, you know, it's just the way life works. Stacy moved to LA and was eager to get settled into her new place. There was only one room in the apartment. It went to Ben, of course. Stacy took the kitchen. She bought herself a cot, which she put by the window at night and put away in the closet in the morning. Edward came often at first. They walked along the promenade, as they had before, and sat in cafes. With him, Stacy felt invaluable, important, loved, not like at home. Edward had urged her to move in with him. "But if you don't want to move in with me, let's go somewhere else," he suggested. Svetlana moved to the city to be near her son Matvey and to help him. She soon discovered that Matvey had a serious problem with alcoholism. He was drinking a lot, coming home late at night or in the morning. At first, Svetlana was very worried about her son, afraid that something would happen to him because of his drinking. But then she got used to his nocturnal strolls. Svetlana began to take care of the drunk Matvey. In the morning, she brought pills, water, cleaned up after him. Matvey's alcoholism progressed. He degenerated, became stupid, aggressive, helpless. Svetlana blamed herself for her son's problems, believing that the absence of a father and Matvey's unknown origin had an impact. She speculated that Matvey's alcoholism could have been passed on genetically. Svetlana fully supported and served her son. She cooked, cleaned, and bought groceries. Matvey did not work anywhere because of his drinking and lived on his mother's full support. In general, a difficult situation is described when an elderly mother is forced to have full custody of her adult alcoholic son, having given up her personal life. The son degenerates, but the mother cannot abandon him. Ben didn't bother to work. After a while, the son started demanding money from Stacy when he didn't have enough to drink. And this happened quite often because the man earned a living by rare casual earnings, which fell out infrequently. His soul demanded alcohol on a regular basis. Stacy, feeling sorry for her son, at first gave him money for pocket money and then tried to stop giving money. But Ben still took money from his relative. Sometimes he quietly took money out of his mother's purse. Sometimes he got his way with threats and rudeness. Stacy felt miserable and confused. Living with her own son had become a nightmare. Ben would yell at his mother, sass her for no reason. He would take her money. Therefore, the woman tried, having received a payment, to immediately make a stock of food for a long time. The adult son has not yet raised his hand on his elderly parent. But looking into Ben's empty, embittered eyes, Stacy realized that the moment was not far off. The only outlet for Stacy was her walks with Edward. He still visited her in town whenever he could. The woman didn't talk about her life. It was embarrassing, hard. She couldn't share this misery with anyone at all. In front of others, Stacy put on the mask of a prosperous and happy woman. One day, Edward told Stacy news that made her heart ache. "I'm moving soon," he said, looking away. "We won't be able to see each other much." Whereto Stacy sighed sadly. The only person she'd felt human lately was Edward, and now it looked like their meetings were about to end. "To the sea, to Nashville," he answered. "With his son's family. You know, I'm having trouble with my lungs. The doctor told me to change the climate or else. But never mind, my son has decided to move with me. My daughter's still thinking about it. But it looks like she's going to do it too. So that's that." "That's too bad," Stacy said sadly. She tried to fight the tears that had come to her eyes. "Stacy, I'm begging you, please come with me. You helped your son solve problems when he was in a difficult situation. He'll figure it out on his own. He's not a little boy anymore, are you? We'll live by the sea." Imagine how happy that would be. "Think about it," Edward said. Stacy realized she wasn't going anywhere. How would she leave Ben? Edward just didn't know anything about Ben's addiction. He didn't know that he hadn't been making any money for a long time. Without his mother, Ben would be lost, completely lost. And how could she enjoy the sea, the sun, and the company of a loving Edward, knowing that her son is dying alone in a distant city? Edward was gone. Stacy took his absence hard. They called each other, texted each other. Of course, Edward sent pictures of beautiful landscapes and beckoned, still calling Stacy, telling her how good it would be together. But the woman felt responsible for the son she'd given birth to, the one she hadn't raised. So she had to be there for him, to help, to support him. Sometimes because of these thoughts, the woman felt terrible, but she could not do anything about it. A few more years passed. Stacy had grown old. She probably could have looked better and younger, but not with this life. Ben continued to drink and adamantly refused treatment. He started taking company home, and it was much harder than when Stacy waited nights for her son. These marginal-looking people, women, put-down men, laughed loudly in Ben's room. Drinking, arguing, even fighting sometimes. When Stacy tried to talk some sense into her son, he snapped at her. He stopped seeing his mother as a person at all. And then Kate, Ben's common-law wife, showed up at the apartment. There was no hope that she would have a positive effect on her son. Kate was a drinker herself. While Ben usually didn't touch his mother except when he needed money, Kate clung to her mother-in-law on and off. Eventually, she and Ben had managed to turn Stacy against her. He was now convinced that his mother intended to break him up with his beloved and hated Kate. Scolding, quarrels, scandals, all this now waited for Stacy every day. And she hadn't saved her son. She hadn't built a personal happiness with Edward. She could be living with a man who'd loved her all her life on the beach. Dreams, that's all. What about Ben, without her supervision? No, she gave a man life, so she must be responsible for him. Well, I guess that's her fate now. The rain had eased off considerably. Stacy took advantage of the respite to make her way to the driveway. This time she was in a hurry, in case it rained again. She was delaying her return, too, because there was nowhere else to go. It looked like Kate and Ben were having company again tonight. We'd be out till morning in the only room they had. They'll be in the kitchen, of course, going to the fridge. Stacy just filled it with groceries. That's a good thing. We'll probably have to go to the store again tomorrow, if there's any money left. Stacy would lie on her cot all night, pretending to sleep, listening to the sounds of the party in the next room. Her main task now is not to disturb her son, Kate, and their guests. Going up to her floor on foot, there had never been an elevator in this old house. The elderly woman stopped. All the doors as dug in. On the landing stood her suitcases, the same one she had moved here from the village with. Stacy opened one of them. Her belongings lay there. Nothing made sense. The woman tried to open the door with her key. It didn't work. Someone had clicked the lock so it wouldn't unlock from the outside. So Stacy knocked loudly. Their bell hadn't worked in a long time. The door swung open. A happy Kate stood on the doorstep, hands at her sides, feet shoulder-width apart. She was smiling strangely. "What's the matter?" Stacy asked. "Seriously, you old hag," Kate said in a luscious voice. "This is my apartment. Why on earth would I leave? It's not yours, it's Ben's. It's in his name. I saw the paperwork myself the other day. You're nobody here." "Then get out of here," Stacy said. Ben's head peeked out from behind Kate. "Yeah, that's what we've decided. You need to go. You don't give us a life, you're always giving us advice," Ben said. "You mind your own business. Are you trying to break Kate up with me too? We'd better live separately." "What are you going to live on?" Stacy didn't understand. She'd long ago realized that her son had no warm feelings for her, but he needed his mother at least as a source of funding. "You don't know anything, do you?" Kate smirked. "I'm expecting a baby in a couple months. I've already got sick pay, maternity pay. And then every month for the child will be paid, so we're doing great." Stacy glanced at her sister-in-law's figure. Yes, her belly was showing under the sweater, but Kate had never been particularly slender, so the woman didn't notice anything. That's news to her. Ben and Kate are having a baby. Poor baby. What's it like growing up with parents like that? And will that baby ever survive? Stacy's eyes darkened at the news. The news of the baby eclipsed even the fact that she was being kicked out of her own home. She felt unbearably sorry for this unborn baby, grandson or granddaughter. At the same time, the woman realized that she was unable to save him, to make his life even a little easier. It would be better to deal with her own fate. "So get out of here," Kate smiled again. "Son? But where am I supposed to go?" Stacy turned to Ben. "You can't live on the streets. You've got a boyfriend in the village. Go to him." Ben said nonchalantly, "Do you have somewhere else to go?" I don't understand. Ben didn't know that Edward had moved to another state from where he'd never been interested in his mother's affairs. And you have a rich sister who won't leave you, Kate added and slammed the door shut. Stacy picked up her suitcases and went outside. What else could she do? There wasn't a single thought in her head about where to go. Edward was far away. Vivi's sister was even farther away. No one wanted her. Lonely, abandoned, now homeless. She must have deserved it somehow. She's ashamed to even tell the people she knows how life turned out. Her own son, for whom Stacy's mother lived, kicked her out of the house. Out of the house. The rain had stopped, but the icy wind had picked up. It burned his cheeks and made his eyes water. It was rapidly getting darker. There were hardly any people on the streets anymore. Stacy was finally exhausted. She set her suitcases down at an empty bus stop, sat on them, and let the tears flow. They poured down her cheeks, and the woman didn't even wipe her face. She wept for her unfulfilled hopes for her son, sobbed for the plight of Ben and her unborn grandson. But their own future, of course, was a source of anxiety and apprehension. Where to go, from whom to ask for help. Staying outdoors on a cold November night was a pleasure, and something would happen. A pleasant young girl's voice came from somewhere behind her. Stacy turned around. A young woman was looking at her. Tall, thin, tight jeans, sneakers, a deep hooded sweatshirt, and eyes. Attentive, sympathetic eyes. Next to the stranger, a small, funny little dog worried, and seemed to look at Stacy with sympathy too. His funny face looked so funny that the older woman couldn't help but smile through her tears. DG was born into a student family. Her mom was an economist, her dad an engineer. The young parents met at a student disco. They noticed each other right away, fell in love, got married. Digi was born when both were in their 4th year, each at his own university. The young family was not discouraged. Yes, they didn't earn much yet. Yes, they had to live with their child in a cramped room in the student dormitory. But the couple had so much ahead of them. They dreamed, they planned, they hoped. Digi did not remember her parents at all. She saw their photos, listened to the stories of relatives and acquaintances about these people. And then the image of her mother and father opened up in Digi's mind. Cheerful, energetic, hardworking, a little naive, loving each other and the child. Tragedy struck at a construction site. Digi's mom and dad, trying to earn an extra penny after their studies and main job, were looking for a part-time job. And that time they managed to get a job with a private contractor who was building a sports complex in the city center. The young couple, along with a couple of similar students, were painting the walls. And something happened. Either the cable broke or the platform failed. In general, all 4 of them fell from a height right onto the concrete floor. No one survived. There was no chance. The owner of the construction site managed to get away with it. The students worked for him unofficially. He made it look as if the young people had sneaked into his construction site to take extreme photos or something. A friend of her parents, the family's dormitory neighbor, was babysitting little Digi at the time. The girl spent a few days with her. Then she was supposed to be taken to an orphanage. But her father's sister, Aunt Laura, showed up. She lived in the village, raising her 3 children alone. She wasn't poor, but she wasn't wealthy either. Her family couldn't be called a family. An extra mouth in the form of a niece orphaned overnight was a burden to Aunt Laura. But where to go? What would people say? She abandoned her brother's daughter, sent the child to an orphanage. The neighbors will stigmatize her. They'll remember it for the rest of their lives. That's how Digi ended up in Aunt Laura's family. The girl's childhood was, at first glance, the most ordinary. Digi helped her aunt with the household chores, played outside with her children, and went to school with her friends. But no birthdays with a lot of friends and a cake with candles, no new beautiful dresses, no trips to the amusement park. And no dresses. Digi missed the warmth of the world. Hugs, affectionate words, support. Aunt Laura wasn't strict or mean, but she was not in a hurry to surround her niece with love and care. Aunt Laura had a completely different attitude to her own children. She stroked their heads, hugged them, and found tender words for them. Digi always felt like a stranger to her aunt. She realized that she grew up with the realization of her own unwantedness, and it was a heavy burden for Aunt Laura. Sometimes Digi even felt sorry for her aunt. She was so tired with her work and her own children, and now she had a niece to take care of. DG dreamed of growing up and having a family of her own. There she would be loved and appreciated. She had always spent a lot of time studying. First, she liked to learn new things, and the girl was quite good at it. She was an excellent student all the years. Secondly, DG perfectly understood that education is her only chance for a prosperous life. The girl wanted to leave the village, settle in the city, travel the world. For all this, she needed money. So she did her best. After school, DG entered the university as a translator. She was given a dormitory, and her life of freedom began. Finally, she was no longer a burden to anyone. DG didn't even pay attention to guys when she was young. She firmly decided for herself, first her career, then everything else. But in her last year of high school, she accidentally met Eugene. He was 8 years older. A well-established, self-confident, handsome, intelligent man came to the university to talk to the rector. Eugene had his own travel agency, and he needed intelligent interpreters. They bumped into each other outside the rector's office. Literally collided. Eugene swung the door open, took a step into the hallway, and crashed into DG, who was walking by. The man immediately picked the girl up, preventing her from falling, and began to apologize. DG assured him with a smile that she was fine. She was amused by the man's consternation. He acted as if he hadn't accidentally hit her with his shoulder, but had almost hit her with a car. And then, like a corny scene from a novel, their eyes met, and DG caught her breath. Eugene seemed to feel something too. There was a spark between the young men. Anyway, they went to the window and talked for a long time. They exchanged phone numbers, of course. And in the evening, he picked up DG, and they went for a walk around the city. The girl herself chose such a format of the first date. DG and Eugene's relationship quickly became close and very serious. Soon the girl moved in with him in a spacious 2-bedroom apartment in the city center. At first, DG was frightened and confused by the fact that her chosen one is so rich he has his own travel agency, a beautiful car, an expensive apartment. And what is she? A girl from the village, penniless. She doesn't even have parents. An orphan from Kazan, but Eugene was not embarrassed by all this. He looked at DG with admiring eyes, showered her with gifts and compliments. The girl saw that her presence made him happy and finally allowed herself to just be happy and not worry about anything. After a while, DG realized she was expecting a baby. Confused, of course. It was too quick and unplanned. Eugene, on the other hand, was genuinely happy. His business was booming. The capital was increasing. The business was growing. Children are happiness, the man smiled, stroking DG's still quite flat belly. DG had thought that Eugene would finally propose to her after the news of her pregnancy, but he was in no hurry to take her to the registry office. When she herself asked him about it when they would legalize the relationship, Eugene was genuinely surprised. What for? Well, as the child should have a full family mom, dad. And this child I will recognize legally, do not doubt. And a stamp in the passport, these are such conventions. You know I was married. And the relationship was ruined after I went to the registry office. Then there was so much trouble with the reissuance of documents and so on. So I'm against such conventions. The words of her beloved then shook DG, but she coped with herself and accepted Eugene's point of view. Really, does it matter if there is a stamp in the passport? What mattered was that they loved each other. Darcy was born on her due date and made DG the happiest person on earth. The young mother couldn't get enough of her daughter and couldn't believe where such a miracle had come from. Eugene was not a very attentive father. He had been distant since the birth of the child. Only DG, blinded by the newfound happiness of motherhood, hadn't noticed it right away. One day when Darcy was just 2 years old, the man announced, I'm leaving the apartment to my daughter. I'm going to support her for the rest of her life, and I'm going to keep in touch with the baby too. But I can't live with you anymore. Sorry, I fell out of love, met someone else. It happens. Eugene walked away, leaving DG feeling upset. She felt like half her heart had been ripped out of her chest. She'd loved Eugene so much, she'd hoped they'd be okay. She had to adjust to the new reality. Eugene hadn't lied, he'd kept his daughter's apartment and was faithfully paying her alimony. But DG knew she needed to find a source of income. Eugene's money was only for her daughter. DG needed to work. She needed to establish herself in her profession. As practice had shown, in this life you have to rely only on yourself. Digi realized that, in general, she was still very lucky. Eugene left his daughter an apartment and pays child support. It wasn't much, but it was still money. Still, the pain of the breakup lingered in her chest, and the future looked very dim. I had to get a job. But it so happened that Digi had given birth to a daughter right after the university, so she had no time to get a job. And now, with a small child in her arms and no experience, who needs her? Digi has no relatives, no mom, no sister, no grandmother. No one to look after Darcy while her mother is at work. Send her to daycare. But Darcy would get sick a lot there. An employer wouldn't like an employee who couldn't get enough of sick days. The situation appeared to be a stalemate. That November evening, Digi was contemplating her future. Digi was wondering how she would ever get a job again. Money was tight, and she had to deny herself everything. She couldn't, and wouldn't ask Eugene for more money. He had left them a whole apartment and gave them money to support their daughter. And if Digi couldn't provide for herself, that was her problem. After all, she's an adult, not a child. At that moment, Princess Mopisico, the dog Eugene had given to Digi when everything was still good with them, asked to go outside. What bad timing. It's dark and cold, and there are puddles all around. It rained a while ago, but where can we go? Princess can't wait. Darcy is already asleep in her room. She won't wake until morning, so Digi can calmly walk the dog. The girl quickly dressed, attached the collar and leash to Princess and went out into the November evening. Digi noticed the old woman sitting on a suitcase near the bus stop and couldn't believe her eyes. It was too strange. When she got closer, she realized that the old woman was very upset about something. She was crying quietly, not even noticing that her face was already wet with tears. Digi's heart squeezed with pity for a stranger who was obviously in great distress. "What's wrong? Do you need help?" she asked. When Digi heard Stacy's story, she was horrified. She had longed for a mother, for a close family member. She couldn't imagine how Ben could do this to her mom, her own mom. Digi hadn't hesitated for a second in making that offer. The words came out of her mouth before she could think them through. "Let's go to my place now. You're very cold. You need a mug of hot tea. You can't stay outside." A year had passed since that meeting. Stacy had gone to live with Digi. On that cold, dark evening over a cup of hot tea, a solution took shape that suited both parties to the unusual story. Stacy now looked after the house and enjoyed spending time with little Darcy, who loved her new grandmother. Digi went to work knowing that her daughter was in safe and loving hands. Digi finally had someone to love and care for her Stacy. And she was getting the maternal warmth she had missed all her life. And her daughter had a wonderful grandmother who would entertain, feed, and teach. Ben showed up. One day he found out somehow where his mother lived. He demanded Stacy come home, appealed to her sense of family. "Do you value strangers more than your own son?" It happened. Stacy shook her head. "I know that now. Sometimes strangers are closer than family. And I'm not strangers with Digi anymore." Ben kicked Kate out. Their baby was never born. Kate, being pregnant, wasn't about to give up her bad habits. Naturally, her body couldn't take it one day. The baby was born prematurely. It was a very weak and sickly boy. He did not survive. The poor baby's parents' plans for a government welfare check fell through. So Ben came crawling back to his mother. He needed her money again. He still didn't want to work. But this time Stacy was firm. No. Edward was right. Her son was a grown man. She'd done more than she could for him. She'd sold her only home so he could buy an apartment in the city and pay off his debts. Let him take it from there. Speaking of Edward, Stacy told him her story after all. She'd gotten over herself. It made her feel better, and Edward finally understood her. He went to Stacy's house, met Digi and Darcy. The four of them had hit it off. It was a nice, warm group of people. Darcy even started calling Edward grandfather. He didn't mind. On the contrary, he seemed to enjoy it. Before Edward left, he invited her over. "I look forward to seeing all three of you this summer. No refusal." "No refusal is planned." Stacy smiled. Edward was gone. "Summer is coming. DG and Stacy are making plans for a wonderful vacation in Miami. Edward and his whole family are waiting for them. It's going to be a wonderful vacation. And who knows, maybe they'll move to Florida for the vacation and see what's what. DG will try to get a job and take a vacation and get to know the place. They could do it. Why? Living by the ocean surrounded by people you love and love you. Isn't that happiness? Claire looked apprehensively at the class she was about to be the new girl in. Her father had gotten a high appointment in this town. Like they weren't doing well in New York. No, he needed a springboard to advance his career. His old position had become too tight for his ambitions. Now they'd have to spend about 5 years here. Her arrival did not arouse much interest in her classmates. Well, a new girl came. That's fine. Everyone was talking animatedly about the summer vacation that had just ended. There were some remarks to her. Mom sent me to the country. I was stuck in the vegetable garden, picking all the crops. It's good that there is a lake in the village. We went fishing every other day. Then we fried fish on the shore on the coals from the fire. Girls, look what a sundress I got at the sea. Girls. All the boys looked at me. I was so pretty. Near the window, 2 slightly funny bespectacled men, a girl and a guy, were talking to each other about the list of additional literature for extracurricular reading. No, I never got into this Shakespeare and his Hamlet, said the guy. But Remarque's Three Comrades is a thing. I reread it twice. And I took up the Master and Margarita ahead of time, replied the girl. I couldn't tear myself away. I swallowed it. You haven't read it yet? I'll bring you the novel tomorrow. It's definitely your type. Claire remembered similar conversations after long vacations at school in Moscow. Heaven and earth, a completely different world and life. How could she share with her new classmates that she'd sunbathed on France's Côte d'Azur this summer and then traveled with her parents to the Greek island of Crete, exploring the traces of civilization? They would have gawked at her as if she were an alien. But there was no choice. One had to get used to it and settle in. And she wasn't proud or imagining she'd been born with a silver spoon in her mouth. Hannah had managed to catch her parents' life and her own in a communal apartment with 4 families in the neighborhood. Then her father dramatically moved up the career ladder. A designer by trade, he invented something for the airplane industry. Hannah was never interested in the details. Nevertheless, he had first been invited to work in New York City from the suburbs, and now he was sent to head a new industrial plant in the Northwest, built specifically for his brilliant, undoubtedly talented invention. Hannah's mother didn't come from a wealthy family. She started out as a manicure and pedicure master in New York City. Her husband, with fabulous fees for new technical ideas, helped her buy out a rundown hair salon. In a year, a woman with golden hands turned the institution into an elite salon. She followed her husband like a Decembrist wife. Is it possible that women don't go for manicures and pedicures? Will she be in demand in the new place? In a medium-sized town, the family of a designer, and now the head of a large company. 3-room apartments in a new building were allocated to them immediately. You can't miss such a specialist. Who could replace him? He is constantly generating new inventions. In an apartment complex on the outskirts of the city, they were looking for a beauty parlor manager. Hannah's mother came in handy from the get-go. What was Hannah supposed to do? She couldn't live a sheltered life. Now it was a 3-stop bus ride to school. It's a short distance. In good weather you could easily walk it. That's how she ended up in 10th grade. It was still 2 years until she received her matriculation certificate. When the bell finally rang on September 1st, the class teacher introduced the newcomer to the class and looked around. We don't have a lot of desks in the classroom. You, Hannah, have only 1 seat next to our local star Robin Kovalev. Here he is, late as usual. The table was the last one in the middle row. Claire looked back at her newly arrived classmate. Tall, statuesque, handsome, with mischievous eyes. He was wearing jeans and a blue polo shirt that fit him well. You could sit at the same desk with a guy like that, since there were no other options. He and Robin were silent for the first 2 classes, and then they talked about everything. The guy wasn't as well-read as she was, didn't watch some movies and didn't read many books, except for internet videos. He had never traveled further than Miami and had only seen this sea, had not been to New York, Washington. About Europe and other continents, where Claire had already been, she immediately kept silent. but he could definitely give her a head start on domestic matters. He fixed Claire's broken backpack in seconds. And when the homeroom teacher was handing out tickets to the touring production of Michael Rochan's Valentine, and Valentine Robin had gotten them the 2 best seats. It was a gift from their parents to all the students in honor of the start of the school year. Getting into their drama theater during the arrival of the capital's artists wasn't easy. So Claire and Robin became fast friends that no one noticed how the formidable Robin Kovalev fell in love with the new girl at first sight. It was written all over his face. Claire accepted his attentions condescendingly. After the play, she let him walk her out, but she wouldn't let him kiss her in the entryway yet. She was a girl with old-fashioned views and principles, wouldn't kiss a guy after 3 days of dating. On the way, she told Robin about famous actors and the meaning of Rochan's play, but he never understood the meaning of the title. He remained silent. He didn't want to seem like a silly man, far from the theater arts. What bothered him was a meeting he'd set up with some guys from the neighborhood about some, as they put it, proposal of interest to him. He and Claire were from different families. He'd never had any extra money at home. His parents, tobacco factory workers, breathed tobacco dust all day and sold the surplus off the line to the neighbors. Robin had an older brother who was already married. They all lived in an old private house with green shutters on the windows and a wooden porch that creaked under the footsteps of adults. Robin's parents already had 2 grandchildren running around in the yard, and everyone had to be clothed and fed. So the guy had long ago adapted to part-time work, selling surplus cigarettes to passers-by or unloading trucks near the grocery store on weekends. So he bought his jeans, in which he flaunted in front of his classmates, and a fashionable polo shirt himself. And now he was feverishly thinking about what kind of lucrative offer the older guys from the neighboring neighborhood had decided to make him. They looked a little criminal. Yeah, well, he's not the shy type either. He'll figure it out. If he can make some money, he'll take Claire to the movies, back row. Maybe she'll finally let him kiss her. That dream made him shiver with desire. Claire didn't feel the same way. The timid advances of the first guy in the new place had only boosted her self-esteem. But she was a little bored with him. Where was she and where was he? It's ridiculous to think of them as a couple. She even told her mom that she had a devoted beau. But she'd said, "You should be thinking about your studies, Claire. With your looks and my ability to emphasize them, you will always be worthy of many." Claire smiled contentedly. The burning interest from a cute boy is still nice to me. "Mommy, we'll see there. What's the best thing to use him for?" At this moment, the cute guy was just approaching the meeting place with potential employers in the vacant lot. There was no fear. At stake was a date with Claire, for whom he was ready to get the moon out of the sky. There was one female among the silent crowd that soon surrounded him. Even though he loved his high school sweetheart, Robin was a little taken aback. At first, she was beautiful. Her loose hair swept down her formidable back in a wave of red, and her green eyes looked boldly at the dashing crowd of young men, not at all embarrassed by their formidable appearance. She was built like Aphrodite, brave like the warlike Athena, and made for love like the beautiful Venus. Robin wasn't very familiar with Greek and Roman mythology, but that was the image the young woman conjured up. Pushing this beautiful vision aside, a large guy with angry wolf eyes, the leader of the group with a huge ego, stepped forward. "So that's what you are, the local Kuliban. I've heard rumors of your technical talents. Rumor has it you can pick any lock with 2 pops. Are people lying or stories?" Robin did indeed help everyone in the neighborhood all the time. People would lose their keys to their apartment or garage, or something would get stuck or break, leaving the owners unable to use the mechanism. He'd come over, click a couple times, and everything would work like clockwork. Or at least it would open, allowing eager neighbors to enter. "It's not much of a science," the big guy said. "My father worked all his life as an adjuster on the line, and taught his sons a few things along the way. People do not lie. I'm friends with locks of almost any complexity. What do you want?" "Don't push your luck," Kid, the leader of the local gang, cut him off. "We have a proposition for you, a favorable one for all of us. I won't keep you waiting in riddles. All genius is simple. You'll open the cars for us, the ones we tell you to open. We'll pay you handsomely for your talents. Think about it for 3 days. We await your decision." Robin looked at the leader in silence, at the members of the group. At the smiling girl. He didn't think much about it, so he answered right away. Why wait 3 days? I'm in. Everyone around him breathed a sigh of relief. The leader of the street group extended his hand, and then also patted him approvingly on the shoulder, saying, "And the man, as Vysotsky has it, a proven comrade of ours." Robin opened the first car the next day. The rest was not his concern. He'd gotten his share of the money that very evening. Now he had the means to invite Claire not only to a movie, but also to a cafe beforehand. The carousel spun, the money flowed. The guy didn't think about the consequences. Fate was keeping him safe for now. Robin and Claire went not only to a fancy restaurant, to a concert of a rock band in a closed club, to an exhibition of impressionist painters, where they couldn't understand a single picture, but also went to a country entertainment center, with kebabs and a heated pool in the fresh air. Things weren't moving. Claire wouldn't let the guy anywhere near her body or her soul. He didn't know how to make her reciprocate his feelings, and agonized with this uncertainty all the time. He wanted to ask her directly, "Are we together, or are you just playing with me?" One day, once again, he tried to press her against the wall in the entryway. They pressed their lips together, but she pushed him away. Robin. She called him often when they were alone together. "Who the hell do you think you are? That's not why we're friends anymore. We're from parallel worlds in culture, development, intelligence. Do you remember the play Valentine and Valentina? It was about couples like you and me. Be thankful I'm still spending time with you, but don't ever let go." That hat doesn't fit Robin at all. He left, slamming the front door loudly, and he was gone for a long time. At school, he moved abruptly to another desk, putting the right bespectacled boy next to Claire. After school, he didn't see her off, didn't ask her to go for a walk, didn't put chocolates or apples in her backpack. New Year's Eve passed. Winter vacation flashed by. To Claire and her mother did not get bored. Her father took them to the hot Miami to bask in the sun. In January, the girl returned rested and tanned. And there ran the days of the longest quarter. There was no time to think. She didn't even look at Robin. They were friends. They stopped being friends. It happens when you're young. And Robin had gone off to experiment with car theft. He didn't get disturbed very often, once a week or even twice a week. It usually took him no more than a couple of minutes to work with the lock, and often with the alarm system. The car had no time to make a pitiful squeak, and already changed the owner. And everything would have gone on smoothly, but once again, at the resale gang of hijackers punctured. The owner of the car was a certain influential official. The criminals were caught quickly, and did not treat them with ceremony for a long time. The longest sentence was given to Mickey, but the others were to spend more than a year in prison. None of the boys mentioned Robin. They kept their mouths shut. He got off scot-free. Good thing the kid was in the habit of saving up his stash. He changed his clothes, kissed his family, gave presents, and laid low. Senior year's coming up. He wasn't getting good grades, and after school he had to go somewhere to study. He could use a little capital. Robin tried to tear Claire out of his soul, but she stayed there like a splinter. Sometimes he said to himself, "Well, I'm not Valentine. She's not my Valentine. It's not fate." He met the girlfriend of the leader of their street team at the store by chance. She had faded. She was buying cigarettes for herself in front of his eyes, not the most expensive ones. What did she have enough money for? Slid a casual glance at him. Hannah didn't recognize him at first, but then she perked up. "Are you out, Robin? Skipping school? Why don't you buy the lady some champagne? I'm starting to forget what champagne tastes like." "Easy," Robin said in her tone of voice. "Pick whichever one's looking at you in the window." Hannah, a sultry redhead, chose a local red sparkling wine that tasted good. She bought a box of assorted cakes, a slice of cheese, and a bag of mixed nuts. Taking Robin under her arm, she whispered languidly in his ear, "Come to my place. I'm home alone now. Ricarda is dying of boredom and boredom. Already what has come to what soap operas on TV began to watch, when in his stall behind the counter is not standing behind the counter. The owner is such a jerk, he hasn't paid my salary for 2 weeks. He says it's a small turnover. What am I supposed to eat, pray tell?" Robin's legs were starting to feel wobbly. This mature, experienced girl had him worried sick. At 16, who wouldn't want to have a peek at a woman like that? He quickly mumbled, "I'll be right back," and went back to the store. He'd have to get the redhead something special. But what would he find in a regular supermarket? The idea came quickly he'd spoil her a little. He stuffed a bag full of tropical fruit, a carton of the most expensive cigarettes, a bottle of Armenian cognac. Robin rushed outside, hoping that his vision in female form hadn't evaporated. Hannah waited for him patiently. She must have been desperate for money. She looked greedily into his bag, approved. "You're a good-looking boy, and looks quite nice, and you are a friend of the head. Come here. We're announcing an after-hours party tonight. Call your parents and tell them you're staying at a friend's house. I like to take long walks, take my time." Robin's feet hit the ground when she said that. He had texted something on the phone to his parents that he would be unloading cars all night and then spending the night at a buddy's place near the mall. His parents haven't controlled his personal life in a long time. He goes to school, doesn't skip class. That's good enough. Moreover, it's a day off Sunday. No need to go to school tomorrow. Let the boy have fun as he wants. It's a young thing, fun, no need for money, and they don't have a penny to spare. Hannah didn't live in the palace Robin had imagined. It was an old, shabby, two-story house. It had clearly been built a long time ago. The entryway smelled, as usual, of sauerkraut and a little bit of cats and mice. A couple of stray cats were just warming themselves near the radiator on a thin cardboard. "I'm so sick of you two," Hannah kicked one of them angrily. In another time, Robin would have stood up for these stray animals, but now he remained fearfully silent. This woman was leading him into an unknown world. He was afraid of spoiling the romance of the imminent moment. As promised, Hannah's celebration of their meeting was very leisurely. She asked him to open both champagne and cognac, but she mixed them together in tall, thin glasses, squeezed juice from large oranges, cut up fruit, enjoyed nuts and elite cheese. Then she suddenly announced to Robin that she was hot and had to change right in her room, and she didn't think to leave for the bathroom. The experienced Amazon and the young tough guy made a great duo. The rest of the winter flashed by. In an instant, Robin was running to his goddess like a faithful knight, henchman, servant. The stash had long since been retrieved from its hiding place. Hannah's appetite had grown by leaps and bounds. His supplies were no longer enough for new boots or pearl earrings. It was a strange affair, no matter how you looked at it. Robin was ready to become her slave. Every time he was with her, it was as if he were dying and being reborn from the thrill of sensuality. He was jealous of Mickey, who was now in jail, painting pictures of her with him. Thoughts of Claire vanished from Robin's mind almost without a trace. So she sometimes briefly resurfaced in Robin's mind, along with the urge to say, "You should see what a gorgeous woman I have in my arms right now. You're no match for me, and you kept calling me Mr. Poor man, smoking all the time. We're not a couple." Claire went to school pensive. At home, her father's company wasn't good. Somewhere up there was a change of leadership. Directives came one after the other, and they were all kind of silly, like commands: "Stop there, come here." These constant swings were undermining the company from the inside. Claire's father kept saying he was going to quit the whole thing. He wasn't a boy to be bullied like that. The women in the family had thought he was joking at first, relieving the tension by yelling at them both. But his character was deteriorating before their eyes. In the clinic, where the woman, frightened by such actions, went, the psychotherapist nodded understandingly. This is a midlife crisis, which fell for a man at a difficult time in his professional life. If you want to save him from an early stroke or heart attack, it is better to let him uncompromisingly quit than to suffer another humiliation from his bosses. That same evening, a major family conversation took place in their home. Claire's mother even took time off work for the occasion and prepared a special dinner. She didn't keep the problem from her daughter. She also told her husband directly what awaited him if he stayed at his old job. We all made a decision together with drawings and ideas. Out. A bright design head like that can be useful anywhere. Claire's father at first refused, all translated arrows on the fact that they will lose a lot in material terms. But his wife was a stubborn woman, and she loved her husband dearly. "We need you alive and well, and we'll earn the rest with a stranger. We'll do it. Haven't we afforded ourselves enough?" eating good food, dressing nicely, spending money freely on trips. You and me, honey, we've seen a lot of things. Lucinda's got a lot more ahead of her. It's time to make a stop. Tomorrow you'll be handing in your letter of resignation. The woman wasn't wrong in the slightest. Such an experienced designer was immediately poached by a nice technical research institute. Claire's father no longer believed the promising promises of his former colleagues that all roads were open to him. Fish rots from the head. The industry's leadership was clearly going the wrong way. The wrong way it was only a matter of time. The girl's mother continued to work in her beauty parlor. Claire was safely into the 11th grade. Life did not stop, only the demands and opportunities became different. The key was that the family came out of the alleged circumstances without moral and physical losses. This is a good time to remember the famous wisdom, God, thank you for taking money. 11th grade. No bright moves in the lives of two once friendly classmates did not produce. Claire has slowed down in her ideas about who is suitable for her as a lover and who is not. She forgot her philosophy about relationships and characters from the celebrated play. All her energies threw to realize her cherished dream to become a stewardess on international airlines. At home with her parents, she kept joking, "My good people. I used to fly around the world as a passenger. Now I want to be useful to people when they travel. It's such a wonderful profession with romantic overtones. I'm with a bunch of brave pilots. I am in a nice, beautiful uniform, and behind the porthole, snow-white clouds surrounding my happiness." The older generation didn't argue. If a girl wants to try it, let her try it. Her knowledge would be enough to enter the Institute of Civil Aviation. Robin did what he could to fulfill Hannah's needs. It would have been foolish to give up her schooling, and there wasn't enough money from the loader's salary to cover her whims. One spring day, when he was about to take his final exams at school, he fell asleep during a counseling session. And it was none other than Claire who helped him out. "Robin, wake up. Wake up." She poked him in the side, shielding him from the evil history teacher with her body. "If our evil teacher sees you like this, you're in trouble. She'll give you a failing grade on your final exam. She'll do it." The boy opened his eyes tiredly and stared at Claire understandingly. Yesterday his beloved had given him a condition: either he would take her to the sea in the summer, or she would find a new sponsor. For the first time he suddenly realized that he was deadly, unbearably, rigidly tired. Even his young body could no longer withstand these fierce physical exertions, when he took the heaviest loads with double payment and tore himself from the last strength. They walked out of the school together. Robin, clueless, tried to follow Claire to her house. She asked him to come over, and he didn't have the strength to refuse. While she put the kettle on and searched the fridge for something tasty, the boy fell asleep in the living room on the soft corner sofa. She didn't bother to wake him up. He had once tried so hard to please her, wooing her, pampering her, giving her a sea of his attention. "Well, he can't sleep properly in my house. Especially my parents went to a sanatorium for a month and should have returned only by the beginning of my exams," she thought. Outside the window she smelled lilacs, cherry blossoms, and spring May. Now she would make herself some coffee and sandwiches and go cram for English. Tomorrow was class, and she hadn't even started her notes yet. Robin slept through the day and the night. When he woke up, he didn't even realize where he was. In the kitchen, someone was humming a popular song. It smelled of coffee and fresh baked goods. He instinctively moved toward the tantalizing sounds and smells. In the cozy kitchen with light curtains on the windows was Claire. She was baking pancakes and humming something to herself. "Claire, did I sleep here for almost 24 hours?" he asked. "You're welcome," she said. "I'm alone now. My parents are at sea, while still affordable rates in the sanatorium, and I was left on the farm. Is breakfast ready? Go wash up now." And so Robin became her housemate. The loud bells were ringing in her ears. It was as if this hard time with Hannah and the warm tea and heart-wrenching connection hadn't happened. The sun was shining through the window, bright and almost summer warm. Not a cloud in the sky. The sense of spring blossoms floated through the room. A stack of ruddy pancakes on a plate beckoned with appetite, and next to it a saucer with sour cream, coffee in clay mugs, a jar of condensed milk, a plastic package with jam. He had forgotten that mornings could be so serene and bright. He touched his lips lightly to Claire's before leaving gratefully. She smelled deliciously of pancakes and new blackcurrant jam. For the first time, she didn't pull away. As he said goodbye, he suddenly thought, she's all grown up now, or I'm no longer disgusting, unnecessary, inappropriate for her. He walked to Hannah's house with a heavy heart, urged on by her. The required amount of money he had never been able to earn. Opening the door with the key the woman had given him, he listened for a long time. There was silence in the apartment. Only in the room there were sounds like whispers. He opened the door. On the table was a box with the most expensive phone that his girlfriend had dreamed of. There were two people lying on the bed, talking quietly. "Get out." Hannah threw him in his direction without even batting an eyebrow. "I waited for you yesterday, my boy, and it's late today." The train left, taking the other passengers with it. Finita la comedy. Put the key to my apartment on the nightstand in the hallway and forget about it. I'm sick of you. Robin left her house without a sound. He felt as if he'd been doused with dirty water by an unscrupulous landlady somewhere in the back of his life. He listened to himself in surprise. He no longer wanted that red-haired, so artificial love, for which he would easily have laid the whole world at her feet if he had had the chance. Nor did he think of Claire. Last night in her apartment now seemed to him a dream, a joke, a mirage, an illusion. He had thrown all his energies into getting away from this shameful city. He would join the army, enlist in the north, become a long-distance sailor, a polar explorer, a submariner, only not to see more of these streets, which brought him nothing but hardship and betrayal. Claire and Robin passed their high school graduation exams without a hitch. She got the prestigious A's and he got the C's. That didn't stop them from getting their diplomas after the day they'd unexpectedly spent together at Claire's apartment. The young people talked sweetly sometimes, but it never got any further than that. It was as if a glass partition stood between them. They could see each other, but they couldn't get closer, despite the fragility of the imaginary barrier. A month later, Claire started packing her bags for the regional center. She was determined to follow her dream of conquering the skies in a beautiful stewardess uniform. Robin left all the extra nighttime unloading jobs behind. Since he was a little older than his classmates, the military draft was just around the corner for him. The girl passed the entrance exams to the institute that trains specialists in civil aviation without difficulty. She put her things in the dormitory, decided to return to her parents for a week, while she has not yet so easily experienced the separation from them. At the train station, unexpectedly met a school friend who saw his family off on vacation. "Claire, what are you doing in town?" he asked. "I heard that you successfully entered the university. You're going to be the pride of our class, a sky wizard on airliners." "You know, Robin, I didn't expect to be such a daddy's girl," she said. "It's only been a couple weeks without them. I miss them. I came here to spend a little more time with them. What are you going to do tonight?" Suddenly, her ex-boyfriend asked her. "You haven't thought about it yet. Is there a proposal?" "Why not?" Robin said with an air of importance. "Let's go to the movie theater and spend some time. I don't have the money, but I can afford to buy a ticket for my friend." They had both grown up. Robin didn't want to puff up his cheeks to show that he was such an important guy. As they say, love us poor, love us rich, everyone will love us. Claire herself had changed. She no longer cared about her comrade's status as before. She was more attracted by the fact that she was always very easy with him. They agreed to meet in the park by the movie theater that evening. Robin didn't take the last row of tickets, so that he could be with his girlfriend in the dark seclusion, who had Hannah helped him get close to. He had no desire to kiss Claire, much less to take her to bed. There was a huge distance between the two women, and he sensed it keenly. After a rather interesting movie, they walked home. Robin told his former classmate about his plans to serve in the army and then to get an education. Claire told him the story of her vacation in Crete with her parents. There they once rented a car to see the capital of the island. They were driving along a quiet highway when suddenly, almost next to them, a passenger airliner with burning portholes soared into the sky. Apparently, the local airport was a stone's throw from the road. This stunning sight was the impetus for her future dream. She had already imagined herself walking with a tray of drinks between the rows of seats. Now she was taking real steps towards realizing it. In Claire's entryway, there was an unexpected event for Robin. The girl stood on tiptoe and kissed him herself. "Thank you," she said. "I've been working on my textbooks all last year. Already forgot what it is to go to the movies, carefree to spend the evening in pleasant company." He didn't pounce on her like a kite, but returned her tender kiss, put his arm around her shoulders, pressed her against him for a split second, and then released her. "Claire, marry me," Robin said. "You're always so sweet. It's not for nothing that I used to swoon when you touched my hand at school. You've stirred up all those feelings in me today. I've changed my views on many things in life. I promise to wait for your answer as long as it takes." Claire was stunned. "Robin, you were crazy. And you're still crazy," she began to make her arguments confusingly. "What marriage? I don't turn 18 until October. Ahead of years of study, formation, career in the chosen profession. I have long ago thrown out of my head all silly ideas about princes and princesses. Now I want something else to stand firmly on my feet in life. And there and then think about a husband." He was not offended by her refusal. The main thing here was to indicate his intentions. Perhaps the girl was right. He hurried, voiced them on a wave of emotional impulse. The truth was that he spoke sincerely. He really felt surprisingly good and at ease with her. "I heard you," he said calmly to the girl. "I will not give up my dream of marrying you. I will pursue you again and again. And someday you will realize that I am like in that popular song, 'The One Who Is Needed.'" They had ice cream at the cafe. "Tomorrow we'll go for a chocolate-covered ice cream with sprinkles and nuts. We'll have it tomorrow. I've got a stash," Robin suggested. During the week, they had time to eat ice cream and go to the movies a couple of times. They said goodbye in the entryway, as was the custom. A couple of tender kisses as a sign of warmth in their relationship, and then they went home. Robin didn't recognize himself. He was afraid of offending Claire with his overly insistent, frank touches and pushing. He wanted to get to know this girl gradually, in small sips, and someday to know her completely. 7 days later, Claire left to study, and he stayed behind to wait for the summons to the military enlistment office. He didn't get high marks on his school certificate. He hoped with all his might that he would make up for it by serving in the army, where institutions were more loyal. He will eventually get his student card. Claire didn't make it to Robin's send-off. They were now in a different format of communication. All day long, when they were free, they texted each other. Before they left, the guy asked, "Claire, will you be waiting for me after your enlistment? After all, now you only have to serve a year. Can you do that without me?" Claire was at a crossroads. She couldn't understand what it was between her and Robin. Love? Romance? Friendship? A friendly relationship with a hint of romance? It was nothing like that, almost childish kissing in the driveway. It wasn't serious. And Robin's proposal of marriage seemed to her to be a momentary mood, not a global approach to the future. Right now, studying was taking up all her time. Like other, more frivolous future stewardesses, she didn't disappear on dates and parties. Along with English, she took up Asian studies and began to learn Chinese and Korean. Stewardesses with knowledge of Asian realities were valued for their weight in gold. She passed to the second year with all excellent grades in her credits. By summer, Robin had fallen out of favor in the army. There were only a couple of months left before demobilization, and he was ready to snap, to go OL for a long time, to ruin his record with a daring act. Claire had the character trait of making decisions in the blink of an eye. She'd had enough of her parents over summer vacation. August this year had been increasingly cool and rainy. No joy. And Robin is serving in the Caucasus near the majestic mountains, around the national color of the local people, ancient fortresses, the sea, authentic dishes in cafes and canteens. She should fly to him to boost his service spirit a bit. Or are they not real friends and close people? Dad and Mom approved her idea, provided money for the trip, booked her remotely a room in a hotel near Robin's military unit. They didn't get the kids' hopes up. Let the surprise be a complete surprise. 2 days later, at the checkpoint, Claire asked for the private she needed from the barracks. Robin didn't even realize at first that she wasn't a mirage. In honor of the arrival of his favorite girl, the command of the military unit was generous. The colonel had signed Robin's leave of absence for 3 whole days. Robin and Claire hugged each other as they walked from the military garrison to the neighboring town and couldn't talk enough. They both felt that they missed each other, that everything was back to normal, that they were so good together, that all their former disagreements were just a mistake. They didn't go to the hotel. They went for a walk around the city first. Claire was so proud of the fact that next to her was a more masculine and handsome man, that she looked at their reflection in all the store windows. In the cafe, they ordered a real Caucasian lamb kebab, warm flatbread with cheese, lots of seasonal herbs and vegetables. Should we drink it all with grape wine? And again, we chatted nonstop. We couldn't believe that we seemed to have wasted so much time we could have spent together. It was late afternoon when they got to the hotel. Robin wanted to book the room next door to Claire's, but she gave him such an expressive look that he hesitated, took her hand, and pushed open the door to a cozy studio with a kitchenette and a huge bed. They fiddled around for a long while longer, watching intermittently some comedy on TV, drinking tea with cookies and honey. The sweets were compliments of the hospitable establishment. Before going to bed, Robin looked questioningly at Claire once more without further ado. She nodded affirmatively and silently too. They spent the remaining 2 days of their stay in love with each other, exploring the local landmark, an ancient fortress with many elegant tower labyrinths, and sampling a lot of national dishes. A lot of time was spent in bed, not thinking about hot embraces. By the evening of the third day, Robin's leave of absence was over. He went to the military unit, and Claire went to the airport. In her hand luggage, she found a first aid kit, which didn't want to tighten because of a packet of pills that kept falling out of it. Claire shoved it back and frustratedly and was stunned. It was the birth control pills her mother had given her before the trip. Impressed by the new places and meeting her boyfriend, Claire had never even remembered them. For a couple of weeks after the trip, the young woman still hoped that the dates with Robin did not end for two healthy people who forgot about the existence of contraception. The logical outcome, alas, was that she began to vomit so persistently. The reaction to the smells of food was so strong that here even to the antenatal clinic could not be rushed. Even the gestational age she'd calculated with an accuracy of plus or minus 2 days. And she told Robin the news at once, so he didn't have to beat around the bush. He replied that he was happy, that he would be home soon, and that they would get married right away. They were married when she was 4 months pregnant. It was decided that she would pass the winter session and immediately go on sabbatical. The birth of a baby was more important than any dream of a brilliant career as a flight attendant. And while they rented a small apartment in the regional center, Robin got a temporary job in a car service. The parents also helped the young family waiting for a child. Their son Cameron was born to them as a healthy little boy. While the inexperienced mom everything fell out of hand, the newlyweds moved in with her parents. Where is it seen that the mother did not help her daughter in such a difficult moment? For a whole year, it was all about Cameron. Robin would come home from his job, which he'd quickly found here, and take turns walking with his grandfather in the stroller. Anyone who's raised a baby with love knows how much care and trouble it is. Everyone tried to please Cameron in the sense that he would remain as healthy and strong as ever. Except that Robin was staying late at work more and more often, under plausible excuses. While everyone was out with his son and grandson, he was earning a penny. How did he explain that to Claire? Trouble comes to a house in different ways. When it sneaks in, when it sneaks out, when it sneaks in proudly. Claire's been making friends with a mom in the yard lately. They hit it off for 2 reasons. Their husbands worked together, and their sons were born only 19 days apart. So they had a lot of common interests. One evening, Claire kept glancing at her watch. She was outside waiting for work. Why not? The weather's so nice, it's summer, it's the second battle. Mommy was in no hurry to come home. We can talk about women's things, her new friend said as she looked at the dial. What are you doing, Claire? I'm impatient. Are you waiting for your husband so insistently? But something began to be delayed almost every day. The owner of that auto body shop is getting all worked up over these second shifts. Second shifts? The young woman asked in surprise. Mine has been home for 3 hours, and before my walk with my son went to the supermarket. There is a lock on the gate of the car service center, and the alarm button is blinking. No one's been there for a long time, everything's locked up. My husband says people are on vacation. There's a lot less customers. Claire couldn't believe her ears. "The lock's just like a lock," she stuttered. "I'm telling you, there's hardly any orders. My husband even sometimes comes home from lunch to take a bath. Can't get him outside with the stroller." Claire's eyes darkened, cats mewed in her soul, leaving sharp scratches of doubt. She quickly picked Cameron up from the sandbox and ran home without even saying goodbye. Her phone calls were not answered by Robin. The caller was out of range. Her mind was a swarm of suspicions and fears. Now she'd just wait for him to get home from work or wherever he was and set things straight. Robin didn't come home that night. I spent the night without sleep. Cameron was fidgeting in his crib. It was as if he could sense that Mommy was worried about something. Robin showed up around noon. "Claire, we need to talk," the man announced in a strange, muffled voice. I was tired of lying and twisting. "Why do you have to lie every day?" said Robin. "I'm in love with another woman. I'm going to pack my things and go to her." Claire felt as if the ground had fallen out from under her feet. Who had said those words now? Her Robin, who had been trying to win her favor for so long. Yes, this is a dream. It couldn't be, because it could never be. Tired, she returned and asked meekly, "You're in trouble at work. So you made it all up. Dinner will be ready soon. Let's eat, rest, calm down." Robin stared at his wife with undisguised surprise. Couldn't she hear him? What kind of lunch could there be if he said such things to her? After all, he didn't want to use harsh, cruel words to Claire. He drew air into his lungs and repeated dickishly, "Claire, there will be no more lunches. I'm leaving you forever. Our marriage was a mistake. I realize that now." Once again, Claire felt like she was delusional. It was him, her beloved husband, her first man, the father of her son. She looked around helplessly for some moral support. Her legs shook, her eyes swam before her eyes. Was her world going to collapse so suddenly on nothing? What other beloved woman was Robin talking about? Tears sprang from her eyes. She made an effort and rushed to her love's defense for the third time. "Robin, what's the story?" "You're telling me a story? Look at me. It's me, you're Claire. And you're my bestie. Do you remember how heroic you were in getting us tickets to that famous play? And the first time you tried to kiss me in the driveway? And I kept resisting. She didn't know what facts from their shared past she could bring to his argument. He can't leave me. It's nothing. A mistake, temporary oblivion. Even if he does have a crush on someone, they'll get over it together, and he'll be back in the family." But Robin looked at her with empty, cold eyes. He pushed away her attempt to hug him. He moved determinedly into the hallway where their large family suitcase was stored on the mezzanine. Then suddenly he gritted his teeth angrily. "How to live I am bored with my dull, gray love, with the eternal nagging for correctness. I'm already sick of you. Not a drop of fire, fantasy, desire to somehow diversify our relationship. Just boring submissiveness spiced with sweet tenderness. What do you know about what a true lover should be? Claire." His last words struck her heart like a hot iron. What's happening right now is a nightmare. She was about to wake up and everything would be the same. Claire woke up to the sound of the bedroom door slamming shut, a shriek Cameron, and she rushed to her frightened son. She hugged his curly head, kissed his chubby cheeks, nuzzled her nose into his nose, which told her, in bitter bewilderment, that her family life had just come to an abrupt end. She didn't want to live, didn't want to think about anything. When Claire's parents returned from work that evening, they found the young woman in complete prostration. Cameron was quietly fiddling in his playpen, surrounded by a mountain of toys, and his mother lay silent, staring blankly at the ceiling. She had suddenly aged 10 years. It happens, but usually temporarily. There was such a stamp of distress on her face that her father and mother looked at her with horror. The daughter now looked like a living, unconcerned dead man. What could have happened while they were away from home? To their persistent questions she had so far refused to answer. Claire grieved over her family misfortune. For 3 days she hadn't eaten, hardly drank anything, only got up to go to the bathroom. With enviable persistence, she returned to the couch, to the pillow, and the traces of tears. Grandma even had to take time off work to be with Cameron. The daughter wouldn't even pay attention to him. Couldn't talk, didn't want to explain anything. But her parents had already realized that her gloomy stupor was related to Robin's disappearance from the house. They wanted to look for Robin at his parents' house, but Claire looked at them so much that they wouldn't budge. The young people themselves would figure out what the problem was between them. On the fourth day, Claire finally crawled out of her hiding place and started talking to her father and mother. "I'm filing for divorce. It's out of the question. And I want to go back to school as soon as Cameron's 2. I'll have to find a good nursery. Will you help me?" Of course, they supported her, assured her they'd always be there for her. They listened to her story of what had happened in her family, reassured her as best they could. Claire was a bit like a robot now. She lived by inertia, fiddled with her son, did something machine-like around the house, but her eyes remained dead. It seemed that the evil accidents of fate had trampled down her faith in good things. She no longer trusted men now. If she had been betrayed by the one who had spent so much time looking for mutual love in her, what could others do? Robin had started seeing Hannah again about a month before his tough talk with his wife. The woman found him at a car service center, stunned by the news. "Guys, your accomplices from the ATO zone threw their boss, they'll be in jail again. And now they are free birds. They want a beautiful life. They think you owe them. They can't clean up their tongue. They can't clean up their tongue. They kept you behind your teeth. Even in your tangential case, you didn't pass. They want to go back to their old trade. But the odds will be different now. You're with them and the whole process from start to finish will participate in the car service business. I'm getting good at it. I got a couple of garages in mind. In them, you will decide the fate of each prey, what to dismantle into parts, where the number on the body rebid and resell." Robin's soul split in two at these words. On the one hand, he was glad to see Hannah again. Claire had been good, but so quiet and peaceful that his cheekbones were starting to droop with longing. He knew by heart how she'd behave with him, and he'd forgotten every time out of boredom. Like warm, like tender, but all childishly naive. No fire and passion, no surprises. Obedient and overzealous. He still remembered how Hannah had involved him in a new plot every time, where each of them had interesting roles to play. On the other hand, associating with former so-called co-workers was dangerous. It would be too high a price to pay for the pleasure of not counting money again. Hannah, meanwhile, was watching his reaction to this conversation and grinned to herself as soon as she saw the greedy glint of unconcealed desire in his eyes. Robin had slammed the hook. She was sure of it. But success couldn't be dismissed out of hand. She knew how to secure it in the safest way possible, so she went straight to the bank. "I've missed you, my sweet, yet daring boy. But you're not a boy anymore, Army family son. I followed your life closely from afar. I've always been interested in you. And now you're all grown up and handsome, and you make me want to be near you again. Or do you mind?" He didn't mind at all. Now it even seemed to him that he had been writing his book of life on a draft and only now he would start again from scratch. They were in Hannah's apartment in half an hour. He was ready to be her slave again, to get any kind of money, to fulfill her whims, as long as she didn't let him go again. He didn't remember that he had to go home to his wife and son. He would stay with her now for good. But the woman cooled his ardor. "Kitten, I don't want that, and I'll give you time to think about it, even if I turn out to be the last bitch. The remnants of humanity are still alive in me. It was good teachers that made me this way. After several abortions from our leader, I can't have children. But that doesn't mean I don't want to experience the happiness of motherhood too. You men always come here for one thing. No one knows how to look into my soul. So now you, who went to your family, must decide who you want to be with. I'll give you a month. During this time, the boys and I will solve technical matters with the site for cars, make a list of vehicles, so that they are already in mind. Repeating past mistakes of thoughtlessness is no longer an option." Robin didn't want to go home, to think about why he had come home so late, to look Claire in the eye, and certainly not to fulfill his marital duty. His wife was a pretty, affectionate woman, but he realized after marriage that his first fatal school love for Hannah ended long ago, even at the desk where they were preparing for final exams together. Everything between them later had been an attempt to distract himself from Hannah, to tear her from his heart. Somewhere it had fallen in again as soon as he'd seen her today. He would definitely never let her go from him now, at any cost. At home at dinner, eyes downcast to the floor, sluggishly picking at a chicken leg, refusing his favorite salad. For the first time he looked at his son with some distaste, how he would have liked a child with his red-headed bestie, not this well-mannered, proper Claire. Alliances were not to her liking. She'd gone to bed with him like a sweetheart and married him in a hurry. Where the hell did she put her Valentine in Valentine nonsense? Shifter Hunter Hannah is the real deal. He missed her like crazy already. The day after tomorrow, they're going on a case. They decided to start big with a cool, dark Maybach. Hannah liked to go big. He wanted to get back at one of his former admirers who'd declared after a night with her that she was dirty and no match for him. He used her a couple times and tossed her in the trash like a piece of junk. He didn't even thank her with gifts like other lovers. He thought he'd honored her too much already. Hannah felt particularly hurt by his behavior. She thought of her revenge even when he almost threw her out of the luxury car on the road, adding, "A lot of self-importance. You think you can smell it on me. If I wanted to buy a small car for a woman, as you want, you wouldn't be able to afford it. But in reality, it's cheap. I can always find one like that." No one ever knew what went on inside Hannah. But her gut was scorched, empty. There weren't even any coals left. So many she'd been through, so many she'd lost. She'd lost count long ago. Always drunk, the same red-haired, beautiful mother. A stepfather who showed her the way into the world of sensual pleasure. High school gym teacher. Struck out with a local gang leader, made her way into the youth gang. She went to see him on a date, and he kept joking about it. "Don't wait up for me, right? I won't punish you. I understand that it's bad for a woman without a man's caress. When I come back, so you'll be with me again. In the meantime, take a walk." I've survived without a man's presence. Only while she was with Robin, a young boy. But even he soon bored her with his puppyish devotion. She didn't need him now, except for business. She waved her finger, and he was ready to do anything for her again. But would it make her happy? I don't think so. She's long since lost all feeling. She turned into a doll, only when she holds a present and a new trinket in her hands. She comes to life for a moment, then falls back into the abyss of memory. Operation Maybach went well. The owner of the expensive foreign car was too sure of his greatness. The car didn't even need to be opened. Its owner had forgotten the card without key access to the ignition button on the bar. Hannah knew perfectly well where he liked to stop for a glass or two of cognac with lemon and sugar. Robin chanted the signal while the victim was getting drunk. After that, it was all a matter of technique. Only a little damage to the wheels on the corner, and the car was so. Pity about the bird. It was a beauty that no one had the heart to ruin. But Hannah was ruthless. She'd shine before her time with such an expensive toy, and half the town would know her. And so do the inmates of my favorite prison. We'll resell it in another town. It'll be used for parts. There are already buyers who want to upgrade their cars. Yeah, the profit margin will be a lot less, but it'll do for now. Learn. It's a start. This won't be our last car haul. The men didn't dare listen to their leader's friend, and they were far less clever than Hannah, who had a marvelous knack for life, and even Robin, who had completed at least 10 years of school. The procedure of disassembly of all the units with the help of Hintz and Robin's participation was carried out as smoothly as possible. A week later, they were already joking together in the restaurant, celebrating the successful deal. After the party, Robin looked hopefully at his beloved. "I miss you, Hannah. I can't think of anything else." But she just glared back at him and said, "Look at the calendar. There's a circle circled in bold red felt tip pen. 20 days you still have to think, and then either with me or with me to the end. Yeah, I've made up my mind, the moment I saw you again and followed you." But Hannah was adamant. She knew Robin wasn't going anywhere, so she was in no hurry to play family with him. The first car was followed by a second, then a fifth, then a fifth, then a 10th. The criminal ensemble had already lost count. Robin left his wife, quit the car service. Greed was pushing him, taking over, driving him around. Money always seemed tight. In between jobs, they'd binge. Sometimes Robin tried to remember that it would take a long time to fall asleep. His parents always felt sorry for him and didn't understand how he could abandon such a wonderful family and a good woman. And he was all trying grass, sinking lower and lower to the bottom after his red-haired abnormal love. Claire and Robin divorced then surprisingly quickly, without any delays. Claire herself and her parents had insisted that Robin give up their son. They promised that they wouldn't press him for child support. He signed the papers without looking at them, without reading a line. The women found Cameron a great private preschool with a strong group. Her parents became increasingly insistent on sending Claire to the capital city. How long could her sabbatical last? It was time for the student to return to her studies. For the remaining years, she tossed between the institute and her son. Cameron grew up fast, a bright little chatterbox. Claire called him my sweet parrot. She met her ex-husband by chance only once. He was all wrinkled and unattractive, hungover by all accounts. Where had his former statuesque good looks gone? He looked much older than his 23 years. You'd never tell from their looks that they'd once been in the same class. Claire, on the other hand, had blossomed and looked beautiful. In their final year, they had an internship and she lived alone in the dormitory. She wore a stewardess uniform, the beauty of which was added by her eyes burning with excitement. She did not give up her dream to master the Asian direction in air communication. She went to her cherished goal so purposefully that the teachers only marveled at how deeply she could master quite complex foreign languages and scripts. They decided to encourage the successful student. After defending her diploma, she was sent to a transportation company that carries out air transportation of passengers to China. The minimum program in the profession was closed on excellent. All significant routes of airliners flying to Asia, of course, did not start in the regional town where Claire studied the future profession. The destination in her allocation was the large city of Seattle, the main city in their region. At the family council, it was decided that little Cameron would stay with his grandparents in the stewardess's hometown, while she would settle in Seattle, get a little on her feet at work and at home. The airline welcomed the new employee with a modern design, gleaming metal and glass, and a buzz of lively voices. Claire had an interview with the head of department and an introduction to the corporate rules. A knock on the door was answered by what appeared to Claire to be a soft voice with a slight accent. "Come in, freely." A man of medium height and Asian appearance came out from behind the desk to meet Claire. Slanted, intelligent eyes looked inquisitive, but his appearance was not formidable. Rather, it was more disposing. He held out his hand to her. "My name is Bill. I don't need a middle name, because it's too hard for me to pronounce. According to your credentials, you're at my disposal as a stewardess on flights to Beijing. Come on. I'll introduce you to the girls who are here in the office now." Claire watched him move. He had the strength of a warrior and the grace of a panther at the same time. She thought to herself, Asian men are seriously different from our Americans. Bill turned around with a slight smile, as if anticipating her further questions. "I prefer to tell you about myself. I have been living in America for a long time, practically since I was born. My father is American, my mother is Chinese. Does it surprise you that I call America my country? I really do. Seattle was the city where I grew up, got my education, made my career." Claire was very surprised that her first boss had ever talked to her about himself, but he immediately explained his behavior. "I am a follower of Confucius's philosophy. I build my life on the principles he bequeathed in his writings: respect for people, loyalty, virtue, righteousness, the pursuit of knowledge, high moral principles. If you are willing to accept these tenets of his, we can work together." Oh my God, Claire thought. Confucius is all I need right now. How lucky I am to have strange men. One next to me didn't want to obey any moral laws. The other has made morality a virtue. Now I'll have to adapt to these intricate philosophical corporate rules. In the stewardess's lounge, Claire was again confronted with the philosophy of Confucius. A beautiful, she'd even say classy, poster hung across the wall that read, "Pick a job you like and you'll never have to work a day in your life." I'd have to agree with that, Claire decided to herself, and began to get to know her co-workers. And then the flights came running, the airliners flew. 8 on the road, a break and back again. Claire soon had everything mixed up, where it was night, where it was day, where it was Monday, where it was Friday. Occasionally she'd break out to her parents' house, where a grown Cameron missed her more and more. As her son's warm hands cradled her head, he whispered softly in her ear, "Mommy, Grandpa and I have already learned the letter A. It looks like a ladder. And the rest of the letters we will still learn." The woman's heart was melting, turning into pliable wax. But she soberly realized that with her flight schedule, taking her son to Los Angeles would be a mistake. Maybe then, closer to high school, he'll grow up even more and will connect, Claire thought. After another visit from her parents, Claire came down with the worst of the flu. Her rented apartment was close to the office and the airfield. She worked the flight smoothly, and then realized on the ground that her temperature was almost approaching the 40-degree mark. She was shaking, her teeth were chattering from the heat, and she could only whisper in a broken voice. "I don't feel well. Everything in front of me is floating." And she passed out. She remembered the rest, vaguely how she found herself at home, how some woman in a medical uniform leaned over her. "Was it an ambulance? Any ambulance?" Claire asked in a weak voice. "You're home," the woman replied. Claire was in a slumber for 3 days, remembering nothing but someone's hands bringing her some herbal tea. Going to the bathroom, literally up the wall, the same strong, gentle hands holding her by the waist. When she woke up on the wide bed, Bill was sleeping next to her. Claire jumped up in surprise. Claire's mind flashed. Where did he come from? Was he really the one who's been taking care of me all this time? I don't remember a thing. At that instant, after a slight rustle, her superior opened his eyes, put his finger warningly to his lips, and said quietly, "Don't ask anything. I found the keys to your apartment in your purse. After you had been given first aid in the cause of your fainting, I took the liberty of escorting you home. You were barely conscious." My wife Gail, he continued. She was gone for good when I couldn't get her out of an equally bad flu. Burned out from the high fever. Her heart couldn't take the strain. She had just recently given birth to our daughter then and was still breastfeeding her. I couldn't. There was nothing I could do. Now our daughter is growing up half orphaned. I've looked at your file, Claire. You have a son, Cameron. He can't be like my little girl. Lie down. The doctor was here this morning. He told me the crisis was over. Claire later learned that Bill had taken a family leave from work. His daughter was now at a children's sanatorium with her daycare center, and no one was waiting for him at home. They had befriended a boss who didn't care if there was gossip at work, what management had to say, or how subordinates would react. Bill explained to Claire in no uncertain terms. You look like Gail. My heart goes out to you. I can't help it. It doesn't do you any favors. When you meet the man you love, I'll disappear. Until then, just let me be there for you. A thought flashed through Claire's mind, a kind of déjà vu. Misalliance again, as she called the relationship between somewhat different people. The higher powers want a man of a different culture, faith, religion, a fan of Confucius ideas with strange, by her standards, views on life to be around. Is it her destiny to be liked by men from other worlds? At that time, in the city where Claire's parents lived, a criminal gang was celebrating the leader's release from prison in a fancy restaurant. The table, lavishly laden with food, was crowded. Everyone wanted to show respect to their idol. This served time from call to call. In the zone, he often behaved so impudently that he blocked all possibilities to go out earlier on parole to freedom. It seemed to him that in such behavior there was a certain glamour and courage. Hannah sat next to him, grinning, his hand resting carelessly on her shoulder. Robin was the only one who wasn't having fun in all this frenzy. He realized that now he would be pushed far and away. His period of pleasure was over. And was it ever a period? The man quietly got out from behind the desk and went out into the lobby, where he came across a huge mirror. Staring into it, the smooth surface glistening in the light of the lamps, he saw what he had become. A miserable, hunched, pale man with a dull face on which there was no liveliness or joy. What had he wasted his life on? After Claire's illness, Bill acted as if they were now at work together. Everyone took this news for granted. The staff was not envious or nosy. The woman was sure that everyone thought that she and Bill had been close for a long time. And she, after Robin's rebuff about her inexperience in bed, was afraid to return to this area of relations between a man and a woman. On vacation, she brought the now-grown Cameron and Jonathan to Pittsburgh. They took many walks as a foursome, she with Lucinda, Sophia with her daughter Emma. He was very unlike American men, despite growing up in Russia. Apparently, his Chinese mother still managed to instill in him a love of mysterious China, where there is the Great Wall of China. There are so many inhabitants there that some of them live in big cities, not even in one-room apartments, but in some niches, similar to a small pencil case. A bed, a nightstand next to it, that's all the wealth. Claire flew to China regularly, but she always asked herself to make a schedule in such a way as to have time to visit her parents and son in this exotic country. She never really got to know it. Working as a stewardess no longer seemed as romantic as it used to be. After long flights, she was mercilessly tired, and there were a lot of capricious passengers. The woman's life was becoming more and more like a banal routine. Bill froze in mute expectation, and the relationship did not take the initiative, leaving the final decision to her. He touched her hands casually. He'd give her his when she got out of the car. And as time went on, she wondered, was he really insensitive? So she decided to step into the same river twice. Once, after a semblance of a family dinner together in a restaurant, she suggested that he not go home, where there was a nanny, but invited him to her place for a nightcap. He was a wise man and took her hint. "Claire," he said in the morning, "now you know me. I sincerely hope you had a good time with me. Let's think about legitimizing our relationship. I recently bought a small but very cozy house in the suburbs. I suppose the four of us will be perfectly comfortable there. But I'd like to have children with you. People will judge that these two do not burn with mutual passion, do not throw themselves into the maelstrom of love. Oh, come on. Not all marriages are made in heaven. Some marriages are made with mutual friendship and reason. Two people walk through life hand in hand." Likewise, without thinking, Claire never later regretted her choice. Bill was the epitome of warmth, kindness, loyalty, gentleness. On the anniversary of the already old designer in a small provincial town gathered his entire family, his beloved faithful wife, daughter with her husband, their 4 children. He had something to be proud of. His grandchildren were all like a match. The eldest, Cameron, was already in the 5th grade, followed by Emma in the 4th grade. The twins Jonathan and Michael were younger. They were also in kindergarten. Their mother had completely abandoned her profession as a flight attendant, devoting herself entirely to the younger generation. She could afford it. Her husband Bill had been the director of a transportation company for several years. He loved his large family. He spoiled both his wife and the boys with enthusiasm. After the guests left, Claire and her mother cleaned up the dishes and whispered in the kitchen. The older woman was telling her daughter about a recent incident. "A ragged, dirty man with shaky hands knocked on our door late one night. I hardly recognized him as Robin. He was begging, 'Give me money for a bottle.' My soul is burning. I can't bear it. My parents and brother won't give me a penny." "I see you've already drunk your soul, Robin. Get out of here before I call my husband." "Anybody can poke you with a finger and knock you down," I said. "What do you know about life?" said her former son-in-law and father of her eldest grandson. "I burned myself on the fire of love, but now I'm responsible for my shitty fate. At least pour me a glass out of the goodness of your heart." I gave him a whole bottle of vodka, Claire's mother confessed. He's a missing person, after all. Claire thought again and went to put the clean dishes in the cupboard. Everyone chooses his or her own path. Some of them take the curve, some of them take the hard but straight road. Now, who is to blame for all this? She stopped thinking and went to put the children to bed. She herself had everything worked out just right. Though she did not become for her man the ideal Valentina, the right one who lives in a fictional play. But here she is, real and happy. George sat at the kitchen table and smoked one cigarette after another near the open window. It had been freezing since mid-January, but the cold penetrating from the street into the apartment did not bother the man. He was in such a state that such trifles did not bother him now. Outside the window, a gray, dull dawn was dawning. The meeting with the notary at 11. There was still plenty of time. Vanessa slept sweetly in the bedroom, wrapped in warm blankets. Unlike George, she was clearly happy about the whole situation. And that was strangely repulsive to him. Until a couple months ago, George had thought this girl was perfect. Beautiful, determined, ambitious, smart. She's got a way with words. When necessary, she'll make a joke. When necessary, she'll put you in your place. And most importantly, gentle and loving. A real woman. Next to such men feel strong, necessary. Not like Madison. Eric Madison. George's heart ached again. His wife, after all. She wasn't a stranger to him at all. Despite Vanessa's presence, despite everything that had been going on lately. Madison. Charlotte. Queen Madison. They met while they were still students. The girl was a finance and economics major. George was a law student. No, the guy never particularly dreamed of becoming a lawyer. Since childhood, he read a lot. He especially liked stories about relationships. Love, passion, hate, fear. It was interesting to unravel the intentions of the characters, to speculate about why they acted in this or that way. No wonder that his essays on literature were the most profound and interesting. The teacher even read out some fragments in front of the class. George also drew a lot. His desk drawer was full of sketchbooks, sketches, all kinds of drawings. Fantastic creatures, courageous warriors, just unusual ornaments. Drawing was soothing, calming, and time-consuming. George himself did not understand how it happened he sat down at the table to do algebra. He distracted himself for a minute to finish drawing another character, and that was it. He fell out of reality. He came to his senses, and only then realized with surprise that he had spent several hours drawing. George was clearly a creative person, but his parents were not happy about it. Mother and father, it seems, agreed only in one thing. Both believed that the son needs a serious profession. Did they agree on anything? And, well, the father had some connections. And so George ended up at a prestigious law school. True, he wasn't the least bit interested in his studies. But what can you do? Parents said that you must study, otherwise you will not achieve anything in life. And George was used to believe his parents and obey them. But at university, he met Madison. George noticed her during his freshman year. She was interesting looking, not beautiful? No. But there was something aristocratic about her. They didn't call her Queen Madison for nothing. Snow-white skin, beautiful intelligent eyes of the darkest shade, shiny black hair, always smoothly styled, clear cheekbones, a nose with a slight hump and a confident line of lips, and most importantly, regal posture and sharp, but still surprisingly graceful movements. Even later, George learned that Madison as a child attended a ballet studio, which hated with all his soul. Parents insisted, the girl must move beautifully. And Madison worked her ass off in ballet shoes all the time she was supposed to. George really understood her. His parents also knew what was best for him. Madison was always busy. She didn't just look like a businesswoman. She was one, participating in some contests and conferences, working part-time for the university. George didn't know how he had gotten so much information about this girl. She didn't notice him at all, didn't even know about the existence of such a modest, quiet guy. And George, no, he wasn't in love with her. He was attracted to a completely different type of girl, but for some reason he wouldn't let Madison out of his sight. George was in his 4th year of college. It was summer weather. The middle of May, the time of credits, the time to get admission to the session. The boy went out for a walk to the ice cream stand. Since morning he had been reading a thick notebook with notes, preparing for tomorrow's test. He decided to take a break. He was about to round the corner of the neighboring house when he heard behind him a loud growl from somewhere far away and a startled exhalation. That sound was what made George turn around. He hadn't expected to see this at all. Madison. Before, the guy had only seen her within the walls of the university. George knew that the girl lived somewhere in the center, renting an apartment, since she herself was not local. From somewhere, either from a village or from a regional town. And here she was, right next to George's house. It's strange, but there was no way to ponder it for long. 2 large dogs approached Madison. There had been a lot of stray dogs around here lately. There was a construction site nearby, so the animals lived somewhere behind the fence. The builders kind of fed them at first, but then construction stopped. Temporarily or permanently. George didn't know. And now hungry packs were roaming the neighborhood. There were attacks on people. Just now, 2 dogs were attacking Madison. The girl saw the look in the boy's eyes. And there was so much hope in her eyes that George, always a little cowardly and indecisive, just couldn't do otherwise. He grabbed a large boulder off the ground and headed straight for the dogs. He thought that if the dogs came at him, at least one of them would be able to hit him over the head with the rock. Maybe even stun the beast for a while. But then what would he do? There's still the other dog. There was no time to think about that. Just like that, George had become a hero. The boy approached Madison and asked, trying to keep his voice firm, not shaking. Are you okay? They didn't do anything to you?" No, she shook her head, looking at her savior gratefully. "Thank you very much. I was confused." The girl was transforming from a confused and frightened, fragile victim into herself, into Queen Madison. Madison's gaze became firm, her movements and voice became confident. "Yeah, we've got some hungry dogs running around because of the frozen construction site, attacking a lot of people," the girl sighed. "I feel sorry for them, on the one hand. In the end, it's all our fault, humans. Listen, were you in a hurry?" "No," honestly, George replied. "Then can I ask you to walk me to 15 Lipovaya, please? I'm confused about the neighborhood. And I'm afraid of running into dogs again, to be honest. Can you walk me?" George felt like a real hero. Queen Madison herself was counting on him. "Oh my gosh. I will, of course." George deliberately took Madison the long way, even though he could have taken a shortcut through the courtyards. It was just nice to walk and talk to her like that. Madison turned out to be a wonderful conversationalist, intelligent, attentive, understanding. It turned out they liked the same books. Who knew? But no matter how George looped Lipovaya, 15 eventually grew in front of the two companions. "Well, here we are. Thank you again. I'm with the same group. We're studying together for a test." "All right," Madison said. "I'm at Orakov State University. Finance and economics?" I know, George smiled, pleased with the effect. Madison was surprised. "How do you know?" "I go to law school there too. I've just seen you around, that's all. By the way, I have a midterm tomorrow too." Wow, what a small world. "It's not a small world, it's our Orakovskaya." Madison smiled charmingly and disappeared down the driveway. That day, George couldn't think of anything but Madison's deep, dark eyes. At least he was almost ready for his midterm. He'd never had any romantic feelings for this girl before, even though he'd known her, seen her, kept her in his sights. And now that they'd talked, Madison was like a spell on him. It was her pleasant, literate speech, her respectful attitude, her unexpected weakness, her fear of stray dogs. Madison was now drawing George to her like a magnet. The guy hoped they would see each other at the university the very next day. And so they did. Not entirely by accident, though. George specifically went to the floor where the economists were taking their exams. As if by accident, he walked past the classroom where the students were crowded. And he saw Madison. She also noticed him, nodded to the guy, and even hurried to meet him. At first, George and Madison were just friends, talking and walking together a lot. They even went to the movies for movies they both looked forward to. Luckily, they had specific tastes, so they went to such sessions, just the two of them, without extra eyes and ears. George admired Madison, savored her closeness. He wanted very much to take her hand, maybe even kiss it. But she was acting like a friend, like a buddy, and the guy was afraid of ruining everything. That's why he didn't show his feelings. It was better to remain friends than to feel awkward every time they met. He didn't want to destroy the warm buddy relationship that had already emerged. And then they found themselves at a common student party, a disco in honor of the end of the next academic year. Ahead was the 5th year, graduation. Almost the whole road to higher education is behind them. There was much to celebrate. George watched Madison dancing with the other guys and was wildly jealous. No, the girl didn't owe him anything. They weren't even considered a couple. George himself was free to dance with whomever he wanted, but these guys were hugging Madison in the dance. They made him resentful and furious. They called George names, but he didn't show it. He joked and laughed with his friends. He even entered some silly contests. And then, late in the evening when everything was over, Madison herself approached George. The guy noticed that the girl wasn't exactly sober. Officially, strong drinks were forbidden at this party, but of course they were actually present. "Don't you like me at all?" Madison asked with stunning directness. "Of course you do," George said, confused. He hadn't expected to hear that. "I mean, as a girl," Madison explained. "I'm not pretty, but I'm not ugly. Thin lips, tall, too thin. No shape. Do you like other girls?" And Madison was almost right. Until a few months ago, George did like other girls, so-called model girls. But now, Now there was no one prettier or more attractive to him than Madison. I guess now was as good a time as any to tell him that. But for some reason he couldn't find the right words. Madison, on the other hand, was very talkative. "Haven't you noticed how I feel about you? But we talk so much. And all the time I've been waiting for some sign from you that would make me think you like me too. But all you see in me is a friend, and now I've ruined everything." George shook his head negatively, glaring at the girl. "So be it. At least I'll finally tell you what I think. I'm in love, George, with you. Can you believe it? I always thought I liked guys who were more masculine, brutal, like athletes. I tried to hang out with this basketball player, and he turned out to be a fool. And all the other guys I hung out with were just as stupid. And you're not. You're different. Smart, understanding, real." George smiled. It was nice to hear Madison say that. He didn't know what to say in response, so he just put his arms around her, pulling her against him. The girl rested her head on his shoulder and continued her monologue. "I danced with all those people tonight too, didn't I? Only because of you. Only to make you jealous. But you remained indifferent. It hurt so much." "You don't understand," George sighed. "You're just like me." "What do you mean?" Madison pulled away and looked into George's eyes with interest. And then he did what he'd dreamed of doing for so long. George kissed the girl. They started dating. Quiet, modest law student and bright, successful beauty Madison, so different in temperament and character, but at the same time very similar in many ways. They had so many common, interesting topics of conversation, so many joint activities that both of them enjoyed. George and Madison really were like two halves of the same whole. It was Madison who helped George decide what he really wanted to do with his life. "You're a born psychologist," she once said. "You have a keen sense of people, interested in the feelings and thoughts of others. Try it, take a course. Maybe you'll get somewhere." And George listened. After graduation, he got a job at a law firm, did boring, routine work, got a pittance, and at the same time studied to be an online psychologist. That's what he really enjoyed. This was what he was really passionate about. "I told you," Madison smiled smugly. "I'm almost never wrong." Madison herself, meanwhile, was actively building her own business. She already owned an attire. This choice was not accidental. At school, Madison always studied on excellent, and only her hands were growing out of the wrong place, as the girl herself expressed it. The only problem she had was with labor lessons, where it was necessary to sew and the girl could not do it. Madison tried very hard, but all the same, the products of her classmates came out much more beautiful and neat. "Oh, I'm so bad with my hands." The technology teacher sighed over her students' creations. "No, it's not your thing. And how will you live, such an inept?" "I'm going to open my own attire," Madison promised her teacher. "Of course you'll marry a prince and become a millionaire. Is that what you all think when you're young?" The teacher didn't believe the girl, but she did grow up and opened an outlier. George supported Madison, and she supported him. Madison developed the attire, and George tried himself as a psychologist, began to counsel people. They lived together in a rented apartment. They didn't talk about marriage, but it was implied in the future, as if by itself. And then, Madison's business trip abroad came out of the blue. She had an opportunity to study at a prestigious business school. But it meant a long separation. "It's such a chance. You have no idea," Madison said, her eyes burning with excitement. George, of course, was happy for his beloved, but he was also worried. After all, it was not a matter of 1 month or even 6 months. Madison was to spend about 2 years abroad. How would that affect their relationship? For some reason, George had thought she'd find someone there and wouldn't want to go back at all. But he was wrong. The relationship really didn't stand the test of distance. But the blame for this was not on Madison. For the first time after his beloved left, George wasn't himself. He missed her so much. He'd missed her desperately from the moment he'd left Madison at the airport. He'd been doing everything on autopilot, working in his law office, counseling clients as a psychologist. Did they socialize? Sure, almost every night. Madison looked tired but happy and enthusiastic. I like everything teachers, practical classes, even hours-long lectures. The girl shared her impressions with George. As usual, he spoke encouraging words and supported her. As time went on, the video sessions became increasingly rare. There was no time for Madison. The course was intense. Sometimes she just didn't have the time or energy to talk to George. He, of course, was getting himself worked up. It seemed to him that Madison had someone else. Their conversations were too superficial, infrequent, and short. Being a psychologist, George realized that it was his complexes. His distrust of Madison and fear of losing her all stemmed from insecurity. It seemed to George that there are plenty of young men around who are both prettier and more successful than he is. Of course, Madison compares and may be thinking about starting a relationship with someone else, someone more deserving. When Madison was around, he saw her eyes full of tenderness and acceptance, felt her warmth and sympathy. But now she was far away, and George began to think that Madison didn't love him at all, that she was worthy of more, that he wasn't up to her level. Madison is a successful beauty who has already started her own business. While she is studying abroad, the business is run by the manager, a former classmate of the girl, the same friend on the way to which Madison was attacked by dogs. And him. He's just a lowly lawyer with a salary of 30,000 rubles and an aspiring psychologist. It remains to be seen if he'll succeed in either of those fields. At this very moment in the life of George appeared Charlotte, a girl who recently broke up with a young man and now felt broken and depressed. That's why she turned to a psychologist. George consulted online. His clients were from different cities, but it so happened that Charlotte was his neighbor. She lived literally 2 blocks away. George realized this when he saw the view outside the window behind the beautiful girl on the screen. Huge, disturbing eyes of an amazing violet hue, long brown hair, cute, and very pleasant facial features. Charlotte was so touching, so soft and feminine. She was not at all like Madison, who was rushing toward her goal and was used to sweeping away all obstacles in her way. Charlotte was 4 years younger than George. She was still in her 3rd year of university, and they had been dating for about 6 years, since high school. Charlotte was certain that they would marry soon. Except that the young man suddenly informed her that he was tired of their relationship. He's stuffy, bored, just bored. The guy wanted to make up for lost time to meet with different girls, to go out with friends nights away. It turns out that he felt deprived of all this because he had been dating Charlotte since 9th grade. For the girl, it was a blow. She worried, held on, looked for faults in herself that weren't there, and blamed herself. Eventually, someone advised the girl to consult a psychologist. Consultations with specialists were not cheap. They were beyond the student's means. But George, he was, after all, a novice psychologist, so his tariff quite satisfied Charlotte. That's how they met. George knew it was unprofessional, but he couldn't help himself. The pretty girl somehow immediately captivated his heart. He felt more confident and stronger around her than he did with Madison. She had long been the unspoken leader of their couple in all matters. Besides, she probably didn't have George to worry about right now, and he was tired of feeling not even 2nd, but 5th or 6th place. Charlotte needed him so much. She listened to him so attentively, and she actually felt better talking to him. All in all, it wasn't hard to get the young beauty to like him. Soon George and Charlotte moved their meetings offline. Their conversations resembled not the communication of a psychologist and a client, but a friendly chat. Then friendship naturally grew into something more, and they both needed it to feel needed, loved, exceptional. Soon Charlotte moved in with George. He didn't want to live a lie, so he told Madison everything honestly. It seemed to George that pain flashed in her eyes. Madison's lips trembled. Red blotches appeared on her cheeks, but she quickly pulled herself together, as she always did. "Well," Madison said, shaking her head, "this is unexpected news. Well, if that's your decision, I won't make a scene. We're both grown up and independent. Good luck with your new relationship." And Madison was off. And just like that, it was easy. No hard feelings, no accusations, no trying to find out the details. George sighed. It only confirmed his opinion that Madison had cooled off on him. Suddenly, that thought hurt. Still, Madison was someone special to George. Even after the breakup, he continued to think about her, even though he was fine with Charlotte. Charlotte seemed soft, malleable, pliable as warm wax. She had grown up in a small country town. Her family still lived there, so she had a somewhat patriarchal, traditional upbringing, and that was the beauty of it. Although as a psychologist, George realized that many of Charlotte's attitudes needed work. Charlotte was studying to be an economist. She'd lived in a dormitory before moving in with George. Her parents were not wealthy, so Charlotte could only rely on herself. She tried to study hard as she wanted to get an education, to get back on her feet. Studying before she met George was her first priority. But she fell in love, lost her head with a young psychologist, and therefore pushed everything to the second-plan friends, lectures, exams, part-time work. Everything. George was flattered by this, of course. In turn, he tried to do something for Charlotte, worked more to buy her gifts, take the girl to restaurants and cafes, took on some of the household chores which pleasantly surprised not accustomed to such behavior of men young lady. George bathed in love and admiration, enjoyed care and warmth. He had never felt so loved. Charlotte practically put him on a pedestal. Sometimes George was troubled by jealous thoughts. I wonder if she behaved the same way with her ex. Somehow it seemed she had. Caring and helpfulness were inherent in this girl's personality. Still, George thought about Madison. Such an interesting communication on equal terms he and Charlotte did not get. The girl often did not understand his jokes and almost never knew those authors or those movies that George told her about. And the man at such moments caught himself thinking that he still lacked Madison her wit, insight, directness. And then one day Charlotte told George that she was expecting a child, a very unexpected and untimely piece of news. Charlotte is still a student. George doesn't earn enough to support his family. He's just developing. He plans to study, gain new experience and knowledge. But if there is a baby, the development can be put on the cross. After all, training does not imply large earnings, and the family needs to be fed. George very cautiously suggested to Charlotte to make an abortion. It seemed to him that this was the best solution to all problems. The girl first took offense at him. First she yelled at George, which she had never done before. Then she cried. It was hard for George to look at her like that. He felt sorry for young Charlotte, who of course was also shocked by the news of her pregnancy. But George said, "Hey, don't cry. Do you hear me? Everything's going to be all right. We're going to be fine. You're not going to leave me, and you're not going to leave us now." No, of course not. George pulled her even tighter against him. It's a good thing she couldn't see the look on his face. Confused, upset. He didn't want this baby. He didn't want it at all. No, George saw himself as a father in the future, maybe even a father of many children. But now, it was too soon to start a family. George was living in a rented apartment, working at an unloved and low-paid job, and he was just starting out as a psychologist. And Charlotte, she was beautiful, tender, caring. But George did not think of tying his life with her. It was a pleasant, unburdensome relationship, necessary for both of them the moment they met. George felt as if he had fallen into the trap of decency. Raised from a young age by his mother and father, responsibility kept him from abandoning his own child. Charlotte recovered a little and even began to enjoy the pregnancy. George gained additional clients. Now he was working from dawn to dusk. He had to get the cushion ready for the baby's birth. Charlotte and George applied to the registry office. They decided to do without a lavish celebration, although the bride still dreamed of a beautiful white dress and a wedding with guests and contests. She shared this with George with a slight sadness in her voice. But the girl understood perfectly well they would need the money for the baby. There was no need for unnecessary spending in their situation. George felt inadequate again. He couldn't even fulfill his future wife's wish. Charlotte's a young girl. Of course she wants to feel like a princess at her own wedding. She's involved with a poor rabble-rouser. So she has to shrink and endure hardship from the start. Charlotte was very afraid to break the news of her pregnancy to her parents. You see, my parents were so happy that I got in. I am the first in the family with a higher education. I have so many hopes for me, and now I'll have to drop out. Why? Can I take a sabbatical during childbirth and then you study? No, I have a family now. I know what it's like, all the time it takes. I don't want to be a wife or a mom. School's going to have to wait, and that's why I'm afraid to tell my parents. But I have to tell them. and it's best not to delay. Charlotte decided to go home on New Year's Eve. George offered to accompany her to support her in her predicament, and the bride's parents should probably get to know her. The man was sure he would find the right words to calm Charlotte's overbearing father and her mother. He works as a psychologist for a reason. But the girl had other plans. "No, I'd rather go to them myself the first time." "No, you don't know my dad? He's a man who's in a hurry. He can say some nasty things to you. He can get a little handsy." George was relieved that it was up to him to offer. Charlotte said no. Well, she knows what's right. Let her really talk to her own people, prepare the ground. Charlotte left and disappeared. She didn't answer her phone. Must have been a bad connection in her small hometown. All she'd managed to do was call from the train station to say she'd arrived. And that was it. George wasn't worried. Why would Charlotte suddenly come home to her family after all? Maybe her parents wouldn't be thrilled that their student daughter would soon make them happy with grandchildren. But they won't beat her up. Grumble, and accept the situation. Especially since the father of the child does not refuse Charlotte and the baby. They're getting married soon. George was enjoying being alone. Turns out he was a little tired of Charlotte. At one point in his life, she was his salvation. Pulled him out of his troubled thoughts, surrounded him with warmth, inspired him. But now her care and helpfulness irritated him. As did the intrusive attention, the almost nocturnal gaze, and a lot of other things. When Charlotte did not arrive on the agreed day, George did worry. The girl was starting lectures, preparing for the session. She could not miss all this without a good reason. The girl's phone was still stubbornly silent. So George went to the university where Charlotte was studying, tracked down her group, talked to a few people. They didn't know what had happened. When George had given up hope, a girl caught up with him in the hallway. Funny-looking redhead, pigtails sticking out in all directions. "Looking for July. You must be George," he nodded slowly. "Helen, her friend. We're from the same town. She asked me to look you up. And here you are." "That's lucky." "What about Charlotte? Why hasn't she come back, do you know?" "Oh, it's a story, it's a nightmare. Charlotte's parents are, very strict. She's their pride. The smartest, most promising kid in the family. They were so excited about their daughter getting in. They bragged to everyone in town, thought she'd become a successful economist. And then you came along and ruined all their plans." Charlotte's father was furious when he heard about his daughter's plans. Pregnancy out of wedlock, more like a wedding. Charlotte was going to drop out of school. She was going to be a good wife, an ideal mother, a housewife, instead of conquering career heights. In general, the strict parent decided no wedding and similar tricks early, and personally escorted his daughter to the clinic, where the head doctor was his former classmate. Even before New Year's Eve, the girl had an operation solved, according to her parents, all the problems, so that the child was no longer. George collapsed upon hearing this. He had seen the joy with which Charlotte had waited for the baby, and he could imagine the state she was in now. What's so wild about it anyway? Charlotte's an adult. She can make her own decisions. What about him? He wasn't even asked for his opinion. "That's the way it is with us," Helen shrugged. "We're used to listening to our parents. There's no other way around it." And Charlotte didn't go against her mother's and father's wishes either. Through Helen, Charlotte asked him to tell George that it was over between them. She told him not to look for her or try to find out anything on his own. Charlotte would now be studying part-time from home under parental supervision so that nothing like this would ever happen again. "That's all she asked me to tell you," Helen faltered, clearly uncomfortable with being the messenger of bad news. "She also said that your relationship was a mistake, but she also wished you happiness in your personal life." Thanks to her, George shook his head and walked toward the university exit. Later at home, he thought about the whole situation and came to the conclusion that everything had happened for the best. George didn't feel bitter about the loss. He didn't even feel upset. On the contrary, there was a kind of joy because everything resolved itself without his participation. There would be no child with the family. And it wasn't his fault. Charlotte, of course, is very sorry. Such overbearing parents are not to be envied. On the other hand, it's her choice. She could go against her father if she wanted to. Charlotte knew that George would accept her, would not let her down. And yet she gave up a child and the man she loved. That's good. Life went on as usual. Suddenly her work as a psychologist began to bear fruit. And very generous. Soon George left the hated work in the office and gave himself completely to the soul of healing. In relationships he was now more cautious. Romances happened, but the man did not allow any mental intimacy, and even more so the appearance of his partner's thoughts of children, family, and so on. He did not want it all yet. Or maybe the women were not the right ones. The man involuntarily compared them all to Madison, and each time the comparison was not in favor of another companion. They didn't measure up to Queen Madison, not at all. George seemed to feel quite happy and accomplished. His favorite high-paying job, his own apartment, a beautiful car. And yet something was missing. And then fate brought him back together with the one he had been thinking about all this time. By that time, George was already quite a successful and established man. He was counseling people online from all over the United States. There was even a waiting list for his sessions now. George's services were already expensive. The man periodically published books that sold out like hotcakes. Editions he illustrated by himself. So realized another of his talents artistic. Since childhood, George constantly drew something in albums: fantastic creatures, courageous superheroes, animals different. In general, it turned out well. Parents admired, of course, but strongly advised his son to do something more serious, something that will help him in the future, will not starve to death. And it turned out like this. Now George was even asked to illustrate other people's publications. The psychologist's profession was supplemented by a part-time job as a digital artist. He had to take a couple of courses to sharpen his skills. And now George was in high demand as an illustrator. He lived in his beautiful and stylish apartment, drove an expensive car, had savings. In general, he was rightly considered quite well-to-do by his 30-plus years of age. Many at his age have never dreamed of such a thing. George, going to the bar that night, had not expected this meeting. He'd thought Madison had been living somewhere in Los Angeles for a long time. She'd disappeared from social media, so George couldn't keep up with her like he used to. But he thought that with her ambitions, Charlotte has nothing to do in this city. It was too small a town for Queen Madison. But it was she who sat at the bar with her foot on the leg. She was grown up, even well-groomed, stylishly and expensively, but not pretentiously dressed. Impeccable taste, solemn-looking, the same bottomless, penetrating eyes, seeming quite black in the semi-darkness of the bar, and the shiny black hair flowing down her back. Madison usually wore her hair shorter. This was the first time George had seen her like this, and it was a look that suited Madison very well. Madison was here with her friends. They were sitting at the counter since there were no more tables available. They were having a lively discussion, laughing. George felt numb. At first, he even wanted to leave the bar quietly, to run away, because, well, if they met, there would be something to talk about. And George still felt guilty that he had been the cause of their breakup. His infidelity was to blame, to be honest. And the resentment was there, too. Madison hadn't even tried to find out then, which meant she was already completely indifferent to him. Maybe she'd even met someone there, in a faraway land. But soon George realized that he wasn't afraid of meeting Madison. On the contrary, he was attracted to her, drawn to her like a magnet, just as he had been in his youth. The man couldn't take his eyes off her. Every move she made, every feature of her appearance, everything evoked complete acceptance. Everything was almost native, his own. She seemed to feel his gaze, turned around. Their eyes met, and Madison smiled at him without a shadow of resentment, without a shadow of contempt. George got up from his seat and moved toward her. They talked all night until morning, retiring to the far end of the bar, where the music was quieter, to enjoy their conversation. And talked. Madison talked about how, living abroad, it was not easy for her, studying from morning till night, unsettled life. What admirers. She did not even think about novels. Simply no strength or time for it, was not purely physically. So George's speculation about other men was false. What did you say the other day about us breaking up? That you were seeing someone else? They knocked me off my game for a long time, Madison said. I even thought about dropping out of school, but then, of course, I pulled myself together. George looked into Madison's eyes and understood. He could feel how hard and sad it had been for her. The guilt was overwhelming him more and more. "Well, I got what I deserved for what I did," George sighed. "It's not for nothing they say about the boomerang of fate." And the man told about his situation with Charlotte. He didn't forget to mention that he'd been thinking about Madison all these years, and regret, desperately sorry for the breakup he'd initiated. "I felt like I wasn't good enough for you," Madison admitted. "I thought you needed someone stronger and more successful. And now? What do you think now? Are you worthy of me now?" The question made George hot. He knew Madison was asking for a reason. Was there really a 1 in a million chance that something between them was still possible? "I'm perfectly capable of handling a gorgeous woman like you right now," George said jokingly, but his eyes were serious. Madison smiled and kissed him herself. That's how they ended up together again. Madison and George had both already reached certain career heights. George was a sought-after psychologist, and Madison ran a chain of tires. Incidentally, the same labor teacher who had once looked down on her was now working for Madison. The owner of the network did not tell the new employee why she chose this particular area of business. But this turn of fate pleased her. The gestalt had finally come to a complete close. George and Madison decided to buy a house. They chose a cottage in a well-appointed village not far from the city. It seemed to both of them that such a place would be better for raising children. Children both George and Madison already felt quite ready for parenthood. The age is quite solid, the material base is created. What's the point of procrastination? To plan heirs began even at the stage of preparation for the wedding. Both went through doctors. George turned out to be perfectly healthy. Madison, on the other hand, had some problems. "I wish you'd been a mother sooner," the doctor shook his head. 5 or 6 years ago, everything would have been much easier. But your problems have progressed over the years. There's not much chance now." Madison was upset, of course, but as always, she quickly pulled herself together. She was used to the challenge, used to the struggle. And she thought she'd win this time, too. She always had. George was there for Madison in every way. He accompanied her to her medical appointments. He worked with her to find information about her condition and get her to see the best doctors. As the years went by, the desired pregnancy never came. Strong, unyielding Madison sometimes cried from helplessness. She wanted a baby so badly. So did George. He was ready to give up heirs, if only his wife was happy. George was frightened by Madison's confusion. It wasn't like her. In his world, this couldn't happen. Madison is strong, after all. She never cries, she always knows what to do. And all of a sudden, George tried his best to comfort his wife. When the doctors came to an unequivocal verdict that pregnancy was basically impossible unless a miracle happened, they had a serious conversation. "Madison, this has got to stop. Madison, stop torturing yourself. All these attempts are bad for your health and your morale. Stop torturing yourself. Lots of people live without kids and are happy. That's normal too. Don't you want to have a child, your own son or daughter? Wouldn't you?" "I want, of course, like any other human being, to continue the race. It's an innate instinct, but not at such a cost. Even more, I want to live happily, and for you, my wife, to be happy too. That's my dream. Maybe it's time we accept the situation, let go of our unfulfilled hopes, and move on with our lives." "I definitely want a baby, George. You're a man, you probably wouldn't understand. But if this is the way things are, what can we do? What can we do? You just have to accept it. I'll help you," George said. "There are techniques," Madison said firmly. "There are other ways to become parents. Lately, it's been worth monitoring orphanage websites. You don't realize how many orphans there are now, some still in the maternity hospital, some later being abandoned. There's one boy." "No," George responded immediately. "There are definitely no foster children." The man understood perfectly well what Madison was getting at: a foster child, the offspring of someone unknown. George had a prejudice against adoption. Neighbors Aunt Carolyn and Uncle Mason are good people, kind and smiling. They were always attentive to the local kids and candy treat them, and let them play with their dog, and even sincerely interested in the affairs of the neighborhood children. It was especially pleasant, by the way, but they had no children of their own. George's mother and other neighbors often sighed about it. What good parents Mason and Carolyn would have made, but God didn't give it to them. too bad. May. And then they did have a baby, a chubby little boy named Stephen, about 4 years old. George was surprised. He already understood then that at first children are very small, they do not walk, do not speak, they are carried in a stroller. But this one was so big at once. Aunt Carolyn herself explained to the local kids that Stephen was a boy from the orphanage. How it happens that babies are left without parents, and some are lucky enough to be taken into a family. George was happy for Stephen even then. He was very lucky indeed. Aunt Carolyn and Uncle Mason are the best parents you can dream of. The boys have taken over Stephen's care. The girls babysat him. The boys took him to their games. Of course, in all things giving in to the little guy. And at first, everyone seemed to like Stephen. And then the kid started to grow up and began to manifest in him qualities that at first simply caused rejection, and then grew into something terrible, ugly, unimaginable. Simply put, Stephen became a monster. In first grade, he started smoking. That's when he was first caught stealing. Stephen did not want to sit quietly in class, hit and insulted children, walked around the classroom instead of sitting at his desk. The teacher couldn't do anything with him. Stephen swore profanities, even though Aunt Carolyn and Uncle Mason were intelligent people. His foster mother and father were nothing to him. George still remembered how Stephen's parents ran around the yard at night looking for their wayward son. The neighborhood boys helped them. And then there's more. Stephen got mixed up with a bad crowd. He skipped school, smoked, even started drinking when he was only a 5th grader. Theft, vagrancy. The adults often discussed the situation, and all agreed that genes were to blame. Aunt Carolyn and Uncle Mason were portrayed in neighborhood conversations as innocent martyrs who had shouldered the burden for nothing. They were really good parents, loved Stephen, did a lot with him. But the power of genes. Even then, George realized that blood is not water, and that even the most correct upbringing cannot always correct the code that was written by nature for generations. Stephen soon found himself in a prison for juvenile delinquents, maimed someone in a street fight. Aunt Carolyn and Uncle Mason tried to get him out, even sold the apartment. In exchange for a spacious 3-bedroom, they bought a tiny and old house somewhere on the outskirts of town and moved in. So George didn't know what happened to their family next, but assumed that nothing good could be there anymore, unless Aunt Carolyn and Uncle Mason finally got rid of Stephen. And now, when Madison started talking about foster children, George, of course, remembered his neighbor. No, he was not going to go along with that. Madison did not fully accept his choice. His wife periodically tried to change George's mind, gave seemingly reasonable arguments, talked about positive examples. Only George was adamant. He didn't want him and Madison to turn from happy, beautiful, and healthy people into something like Uncle Mason and Aunt Carolyn so thin, pale, and reserved. No way. Over time, Madison seemed to settle down. She found her purpose in something else. The woman now traveled to orphanages and helped poor, destitute children. It was charity. At one orphanage, she set up a playroom, and at another, a backyard playground with swings and slides. Madison would find out what the problems were in one or the other institution and solve them. Somewhere there weren't enough babysitters, somewhere the roof was leaking, somewhere the students were wearing old, outdated clothes. Madison not only closed the priority needs of orphanages, but also did something more organized directly in the orphanage's circles and sections, so that the orphans could find themselves to show their talents, arranged for children's fancy holidays. Madison got like-minded people. The woman felt almost happy. Although she had no children of her own, but she gave joy and warmth to 1,000 strangers' disadvantaged children. Madison's activities were even written about in newspapers, filmed commercials. George was happy for his wife. Finally, she found herself, realized her maternal instinct in such an interesting way. It was good for everyone. The man himself sometimes took part in the actions, and now he called his wife nothing but the good fairy. Madison laughed and said that she liked the former title queen better. Something of the former cold and unyielding Queen Madison in her still remained. And yet the wife has changed a lot. Became much softer, more tolerant, calmer. She often talked to George about the babies. You could see that her heart ached for each of them. But thankfully, Madison never spoke of adoption again. George thought his life was now set for many years to come. Except that fate threw him a test again, which he failed miserably. Vanessa was one of his assistants who served as his secretary. A young, dazzlingly beautiful woman who looked like a photo model from a glossy magazine. George himself didn't realize how it happened. He and his team were celebrating another successful project of some kind at the restaurant. Madison wasn't there, she had just left for another city on business. Vanessa asked the chief to dance. George saw her huge mermaid eyes for the first time. So close they looked like two green pools. Just stunning eyes of some kind. George couldn't resist. How is it even possible to be sympathized with such a beautiful girl? They went to Vanessa's rented apartment and spent the night. In the morning, George had no regrets, strangely enough. On the contrary, he felt happy around a beautiful woman. Anyway, they became lovers. Vanessa was just perfect, beautiful, unassuming, passionate. She understood that their relationship was a secret and did not seem to claim anything at first, and then began to talk about love, the development of their romance, and even about divorce. George didn't understand himself. He was physically attracted to Vanessa. He was dizzy with her green eyes, her slightly husky voice, her scent, her light blonde hair. But Madison, she was his soulmate. George, being a psychologist, couldn't make sense of himself. Could this really be possible? He fell in love with two women at once. All in all, it was a difficult time for George. Now he felt guilty in front of both of them, both his legal wife and Vanessa. The decision had to be made. But how could he do it so that he wouldn't regret it? And then Vanessa pulled a trump card out of her sleeve. Think about it. But I'll give you our own child. Madison won't be able to do that anymore. But me, George hesitated. Indeed, with Vanessa, they might have a strong, full-fledged family. But it was hard to leave Madison, too. She was already family, her own, loyal, dependable. Betray her again. And yet the decision was ripe. George chose Vanessa. He planned to remain friends with Madison, but the man was still hesitant to voice his decision to his wife. Vanessa was rushing him. She was understandable. She wanted certainty. George, however, continued to hesitate. And once again, fate intervened. Something happened that George never expected. One day, Madison said they needed to have a serious talk. The conversation took place that evening in the living room of a house too spacious for a family of two. George was nervous. He felt like Madison had found out everything about him and Vanessa and was about to start asking him uncomfortable questions head on. On the one hand, that would be better, at least it would finally be resolved. On the other hand, she wanted to present the situation to Madison in a different way. "I have some bad news for you," Madison began. George tensed. Here it comes. Only further his wife told such a story that worries about the disclosure of the affair with Vanessa seemed to be nothing. "I'm sick, and I'm very sick. I've been diagnosed with an incurable blood disease. I just found out about it recently. It took a long time to get a diagnosis." "Why? Why didn't I tell you before?" Madison grinned. "I just didn't want to worry you too much. I thought it was just a vitamin deficiency or something. And then I got this scary diagnosis." Is there really no cure? George didn't want to believe what his wife was saying. It seemed that anything could be cured nowadays, if only there was money. And fortunately, they had the money. Madison shook her head sadly. She put her hands on George's shoulders. A soothing, warm gesture. She was also comforting him while in this state. "Amazing. I don't believe you can't be helped. We'll fight." George was about to leave his wife, but he didn't want to lose her. Like this, permanently, completely and irrevocably. Madison meant a lot to him. She was his own person, his own loved one. He wouldn't give her up to some disease for anything. "Remember years ago when you said we should accept the fact that we weren't going to have kids? Accept the situation. That's what I'm doing now. We just have to accept it," Madison said. George shook his head negatively. It wasn't the same, he countered. Again, the tests at the clinic, the consultations with medical luminaries from all over the world. Only now the battle was not for the dream of parenthood, but for Madison's life. George wasn't about to give up. He studied a lot of information about his wife's disease. Now he better understood the situation. Yes, the disease was indeed very insidious and dangerous. Most patients, once diagnosed, died within a year. But there were also exceptions, cases of miraculous healing, and George hoped for that. Of course, he hadn't told Vanessa about Madison's illness. He didn't want to break bad news to someone in that condition. Vanessa agreed with George's decision. She said she was willing to wait until Madison's situation was resolved one way or another. Vanessa was even supportive of George, seeing how hard it was for him. She knew Madison meant a lot to him, but she wasn't jealous the perfect life partner. Madison was getting worse and worse, despite her extensive treatment, and she was slowly fading away. George cared for her on his own, spending her last days. It was hard, realizing that the fight was lost. The man still couldn't get over it. Madison, on the other hand, seemed to have accepted the situation and even calmed down. The woman quite consciously enjoyed every day, realizing that there was not much left. She met with friends, visited, as long as there was strength, beautiful and favorite places. George tried to accompany his wife everywhere, but he had a job and Vanessa needed some attention. Madison sometimes asked him to leave her alone. They talked a lot during this period. "I'm grateful to fate for the fact that in my life there is a man like you," the woman smiled at her husband. "You always understood me like no one else, felt my soul." "That's worth a lot," George said, squeezing his wife's hand and feeling guilty again. It was a good thing Madison didn't know about Vanessa after all. What luck that he didn't have time to reveal his cards in front of his wife. All he needed was a negative experience at such a difficult time. "I think about that sometimes too." "It's lucky we met," Madison replied sincerely. "You're a unique person, the closest to me," she said paradoxically. These words were also true. George understood perfectly well that he was losing a dear person, a close friend, and there would never be a warmer and deeper relationship in his life. Madison left at dawn in her sleep. Quiet and peaceful, an easy end. As many people said later, a nurse slept in the room with her. Her frightened scream woke George, and he knew immediately. The ambulance, the police, filling out paperwork, preparing to say goodbye. It was all a blur. George still couldn't accept the fact that Madison was gone. She was gone. Not anywhere. Where could it all suddenly disappear to? Her sharp mind, her love of children, her determination, her courage. How is that possible? Peter was supported at this difficult moment by Vanessa. She honestly tried to reassure the man, but Vanessa had never felt him as subtly as Madison did. She said things that hurt the man even more. "It's all for the best. At least she doesn't have any pain now. And the situation worked itself out. You didn't even have to say anything." George shook his head. How could losing someone like Madison be for the best? Vanessa just doesn't understand anything. There were even words like, "Think about it, you get all the kids now, you didn't have any, so you're the only heir. And in a divorce, everything would have to be divided in half." George looked at Vanessa in such a way that she immediately realized what a terrible foolishness she had said. The girl tried to remedy the situation. "Well, I mean, she got sick anyway. It would have happened anyway. And this is such a benefit." "Just shut up," George asked. People came to say goodbye, lots of people. Madison's co-workers and friends. And those she had helped over the years. They came up to George, offering condolences, saying nice things about Madison, and George was proud of her, proud of his wonderful wife. Desperately regretted that he too rarely told Madison how wonderful she was, and yet he was glad that sometimes he did say it. It had been several days since Madison had left, which George still couldn't believe. Then a woman called him, introduced herself as a notary, made an appointment. "I invite you for the reading of the will." George was surprised. He didn't know Madison had made a will. Probably she had decided to make it easier for him to receive the inheritance, took care of everything before. Vanessa volunteered to go with George. "It would probably be kind of inappropriate if it was okay with you." "You're in that state right now. You need support." Vanessa cut Vanessa off. George nodded. She was probably right. He shouldn't even be driving right now. He couldn't even keep his head straight. It would be good to have someone more sensible around. And now George was sitting in the kitchen smoking out the window. It was early morning. Vanessa was still asleep. George was the one with insomnia, unfortunately, and he wanted to go to sleep and see Madison. Maybe even talk to her. George sighed, putting the kettle on, needing to drink strong, hot, black coffee. Maybe that would cheer her up a little. This head felt heavy. George poured the steaming coffee into a cup, sat down at the table again, and thought. He thought back to Madison. Their life, her dreams and plans and desires. Yeah, the world had lost a lot of things. Madison had done so much good for people, for underprivileged children. Vanessa was even seriously afraid to hear from the notary that Madison had bequeathed all her money to some orphanage or children's home. George was distracted from his musings by Vanessa. She flew into the kitchen, anxious, disheveled, but still unrealistically beautiful. "We're late," announced the girl in a voice shaking with excitement. "I overslept. I don't know why you're sitting there like a statue." George, as if out of a daze, came out, took a sip of coffee that had long since cooled, and began to pack. They were on time, though they got to the office when they were still 5 minutes away from the meeting with the notary. They were lucky no traffic, no accidents on the way. Vanessa looked luxurious, even too luxurious for such an occasion. Her tight dark gray dress emphasized the graceful curves of her figure, her light blonde hair falling beautifully over her fragile shoulders. But George had no time to admire his companion. He wanted to go back 5 years, when Vanessa hadn't been in his life, and Madison hadn't been sick. "Come on in," Vanessa said. She turned around on the porch and turned to George, trying to hide her irritation. He grinned. He knew his mistress was eager to know what he'd inherited from Madison. It was a little unpleasant. As they entered the notary's office, an old woman dressed very modestly, even poorly, hurried in. She looked like a beggar. And a girl, lovely, charming girl of about 10 years old. Wavy blonde hair, big gray eyes. George stared and couldn't figure out who this child reminded him of, except whose relative Madison was. Maybe George had met this little girl once before. Just in case, the man politely and kindly said hello to both the grandmother and her granddaughter. The old woman answered cautiously, warily, even grudgingly. But the girl smiled broadly at George. That made him feel a little brighter. Vanessa looked at the old woman and the girl as if they were adversaries, spiders in a jar. She obviously hadn't expected to see them here. "Sit down," smiled the notary, dressed in an elegant pantsuit. Everyone present followed her advice. "I thought only the deceased's loved ones would be here," Vanessa said, raising her thin eyebrows. "Those who appear in the will." "That's right," the notary nodded. Vanessa's eyebrows rose even higher. Whether out of surprise or indignation, she threw another contemptuous glance at the older woman and the girl. "Are we expecting anyone else?" Vanessa asked, putting her foot on her leg. "No, everyone is here now." The notary acted professionally and did not react to the negativity of the cranky visitor. She stood up, offered condolences to those present, and said a few warm words about Madison. Then she took out of a large envelope a double-folded sheet of paper, both sides written in Madison's neat handwriting. "This letter is for you," the notary handed the sheets to George. "You can read it here. Anyway, this is where the deceased explains everything to you." George clutched the letter with both hands. He couldn't wait to be alone to read Madison's last message. There was no doubt in his mind that something very important was written there. The notary then began to read the will aloud, as was her custom. As George had expected, a considerable amount of money was bequeathed by Madison to a foundation that supported orphans. Vanessa cringed when she heard the size of the transfer. But George was getting all the real estate, cars, and even the business. The man, however, had no idea what he was going to do with a chain of Ayers. He never really got into his wife's business. But it seemed that this business was already quite a well-oiled mechanism. It worked like clockwork on its own. Madison managed to adjust the firm in such a way that everything functioned without her direct participation and control. And then the notary said something that made Vanessa jump on the spot like a scalded woman. Madison had left a large sum of money to a girl named Danielle, the same girl who was now sitting across from George with her elderly grandmother. Danielle hadn't even noticed the amount. She was too young to realize how much money it was. The old lady, however, realized it. She shuddered, turned pale, then even blanched. An obliging woman notary immediately offered the agitated visitor a glass of water. "Who the hell are these people?" Vanessa was indignant. "We don't know them. Are they her relatives?" "Well, they're obviously not first cousins. Otherwise, the deceased's husband would have known them. What's going on? It's all done by law, confirmed the notary. It's the will of the deceased. A person can name whoever they want in their will. It doesn't have to be relatives. Who are you? Vanessa addressed the old lady directly. You're frauds? Don't get your hopes up. You'll get nothing. I can prove that Madison was incompetent when she signed the will. I mean, she's a sick person. And you probably took advantage of her condition? Danielle looked at Vanessa, not with fear, no, more like disappointment. George noticed that at the very beginning of the meeting the girl had admired Vanessa. Of course she's so beautiful, just a photo model. But now the idol was turning into a monster. Screaming, petty, greedy. Calm down, George said irritably over his shoulder. He himself was not surprised at this outcome. The man realized that his wife was sure to give some of what she had accumulated in her life to charity. The girl and the grandmother are obviously very poor. Madison must have wanted to help them, but why them? And with such a large sum of money. I'm sorry, I'm not protesting in any way, George said to the old woman. If my wife has decided so, it's the right thing to do. But I was just wondering, how did you meet Madison? Why did she choose you? The old woman looked George carefully in the eye. That look. There was judgment in it. And for some reason, pain. You know, she said in a shaky voice, read the letter and you'll understand. Danielle, we have to go. The girl slid off the chair with relief. What was happening clearly began to strain her anger and wanted to leave this place with an oppressive, heavy atmosphere. Let's read the letter, Vanessa demanded as the door slammed shut behind her. At least we'll know who they are. Vanessa, you see, I have to read it alone, Vanessa said, her lips tightening resentfully. George was sitting in an old coffee shop he frequented as a student. He had chosen the farthest table against the wall behind the racks of houseplants. It was quiet, peaceful, cozy, and lonely. There was no better place to finally read a letter. Vanessa was not so easy to get rid of. She wanted to be with George when he began to study Madison's message. She even had to raise her voice at her. And now George was here alone with that very letter. His heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was going to jump out of his chest. I wondered what Madison was trying to tell him. Well, hello, George. That's how the message began. If you're reading this letter, I'm sadly gone. That's a shame, of course. Life is a good thing. Anyway, it's already happened. Then it's time for you to know everything. I love you. You know you love me too. I'm sure you do. Despite your occasional flings. I know about Vanessa too, by the way. I wish I could have seen her face when she heard how much money I bequeathed to Danielle. It must have been fun. George shuddered. So Madison knew about Vanessa. What a nightmare. And he had been putting so much effort into not upsetting his wife. All the energy that should have been going into fighting the disease. Don't think I'm upset about Vanessa. No, I'm not. I get it. You're the kind of man who can't live his whole life with one woman. A creative person who needs inspiration, a muse. George thought about it. Wow. Madison understood him better than he did. Vanessa is just such a muse. But I never, ever doubted that you loved me, didn't I? You were there for me during a difficult time in my life. Supportive, caring, that's priceless. I wasn't so scared with you. You fought so fiercely for me when I knew I was done, when I had resigned myself to it. But you didn't give up until the end. You have no idea what it all meant to me. Thank you for that. And know that you're my nearest and dearest. George felt tears welling up in his eyes. The sharp pain of losing Madison pierced his heart again. Yes, he felt the same way. Madison. She had been someone near and dear to his heart. They were more than just husband and wife. Soul mates. Soul mates. George would go to great lengths for her, and she would do the same for him. Now let's talk about Danielle. She's a wonderful girl, isn't she? I'm sure you've seen her already. She's so sweet. Does she remind you of anyone? I mean, she's a lot like someone who's not a stranger to both of us. I met her a long time ago, 3 years ago. She was just a little girl, a first grader. You know, I help orphanages. Danielle's an orphan too, but at least she has a great grandmother. but she and her grandmother lived very poorly. And at that time, things got so bad that the old lady had to put her granddaughter in an orphanage. It was hard for both of them, but the orphanage fed and clothed her. But the great-grandmother couldn't always do that. I saw Danielle at the New Year's Eve performance. The children had prepared a big concert. The girl's great-grandmother was in the audience. She was crying into a soaked handkerchief, a sad sight. The girl attracted my attention first by her appearance. The little beauty reminded me of someone, only I did not immediately realize who. "Have you finally figured it out? Or not yet?" I asked the teachers about the fate of the little girl and was horrified. A 7-year-old girl had to go through things that not every adult can endure. Danielle had everything to be happy about at first. She lived in a small provincial town with her mom, grandparents. She didn't have a daddy, but it's not uncommon today, is it? A lot of kids grow up without fathers. It's not surprising. Danielle was everyone's favorite. The young mother was very fond of Danielle. It was said that she gave birth to a girl by a man she loved very much, and he abandoned them. He didn't want to be a father, he was scared. Good thing Danielle's mom had good parents. Of course, they did not abandon her daughter in a difficult situation, accepted, supported, and when she gave birth, they helped the young mother with her baby. They lived like that, and the 4 of them, grandmother was engaged in the household, grandfather earned money to feed the increased family, and her mother was studying at the university by correspondence, because now she had a baby in her arms. Danielle grew up a healthy and obedient child. That's what they call a gift child. Her mother adored her. Her grandmother and grandfather doted on her. There was no money in the family, but adults spoiled Danielle as much as possible. Danielle's mother had a dream to go to the sea with her daughter, show the little girl high waves, walk with her along the coast, breathe fresh sea air. When the girl was 4 years old, the grandfather decided to fulfill the wish of his daughter and granddaughter. He saved up some money and planned a trip to the sea in the family car. It was cheaper that way. At first, everything went just fine. The family spent a wonderful vacation on the seashore. All the dreams of Danielle's mother came true in walks on the beach, and a southern tan, and beautiful bright pictures. But on the way back home on the highway, there was a terrible accident. The car lost control and overturned several times, plunging into a ditch. Already later, the cause was established. It turned out that my grandfather had a heart attack right behind the wheel. A long trip, heat, plenty of impressions, a sudden change of climate. A lot of factors came together. This is the result. The driver himself was almost unhurt, but he was not taken to the hospital. The cause of death was a heart attack. His wife died on the spot from her injuries. The daughter, Danielle's mom, was taken to the hospital, but her condition was very serious. The young woman was placed in intensive care. So what happened to the youngest passenger? It's a miracle, but Danielle survived. She got off with a couple of abrasions and a fright, but not a light fright. The girl cried out at night for a long time, and often dreamed about this terrible accident. The little girl was taken to her only close relative, great-grandmother Danielle. She had lost her son-in-law and daughter in the accident. Her granddaughter lay in the hospital dying. But the old woman pulled herself together for the sake of great-granddaughter Danielle. After all, in this difficult period needed near a sensible adult person, able to take on all the cares of the girl. The mother of the little girl was in a serious condition, but there was still hope for her salvation. For treatment required money, and a lot of it. So the old lady had to sell the apartment where the once happy family lived. She reasoned as follows: now the main thing to pull Danielle's mom, and money, apartments, unlike human life, it is a matter of gain. When her granddaughter gets on her feet, then she'll earn money. Until then, they can live in a 1-bedroom apartment they will somehow fit. This old lady was wrong about the 3 of them. The treatment didn't work. Danielle's mother wasn't saved. The girl was left an orphan. She had no one in the world but her old great-grandmother. No, there was a father somewhere, but how to find him? The old woman did not know the details of her granddaughter's history. She had no idea where Danielle's father might be. And did he need a daughter if he had already abandoned her? There was nothing to do, so the great-grandmother began to raise her little granddaughter alone. It was hard. At such a respectable age, to keep up with a small child, oh, how not easy. And as for the financial side of things, it was a disaster. Danielle's great-grandmother's pension was meager. Her health was also poor, and she couldn't get a part-time job. Then there was Danielle's allowance. It had to be registered and confirmed every year, and it cost the old woman a lot of labor. So much paperwork to collect, so many offices to run through. But the old woman tried, ran, collected so that her great-granddaughter Danielle had at least this minimum allowance. And as if somehow the old woman and the girl lived poorly, saving on everything, already exhausted but kept afloat. And then came the time when Danielle had to go to school. And that was it. The family budget couldn't keep up with the new spending. Great-grandmother got her granddaughter into school, even went into debt. And after that? After that, times were very bad when even bread was not enough every day. That's why the great-grandmother, with a broken heart, made the decision to place Danielle in an orphanage, temporarily, due to her difficult financial situation. And then there was this concert. The stage I saw Danielle, I was hooked by her looks, and the story began. Danielle looks a lot like you. Did you notice same eyes, same look, same brow sweep? And the mole on her cheek, the same mole, exactly the same. I looked at the girl and realized there's no such thing as coincidence. And then it turned out it really wasn't a coincidence. George took his eyes off the letter. How had he not realized that? Danielle really did look a lot like him. It was not without reason that the girl seemed familiar to him. He saw almost the same features in the mirror every day. I started digging deeper. I even had to hire detectives. And I found out, well, don't fall out of your chair or whatever you're sitting on. Danielle is your daughter. I purposely withheld her mother's name before, or you would have figured it out. And I like to keep things intriguing. You know, it's more fun that way. Danielle's mom is Charlotte. Yeah. The same Charlotte you left behind when she was expecting the baby. George wanted to object. It was important to him to prove to Madison that he hadn't abandoned Charlotte. It was the circumstances. Her parents had decided everything for them, sent their daughter for an abortion so that she could study and build a career. And he himself, George, was ready to get married. They even had time to apply to the registry office. Did Madison left thinking that her spouse was such a mean man? That's what great-grandmother Danielle told me, that you left a pregnant Charlotte. Scared, didn't want to be a father, didn't want to take on the responsibility, George thought. Something didn't seem right to me right away. So of course I decided to do some more digging. I found out that you applied to the registry office, but the wedding didn't take place. Why? I tracked down Charlotte's best friend. She told me. The girl's father was against the wedding. He did send his daughter to hospital at first, but it turned out there was nothing she could do. All the deadlines had been missed. Charlotte seemed to love you very much. She begged her parents to let her be your wife, especially since you'd already applied. But my father was adamant. He felt that as a wife and mother, his daughter would never graduate from university. And decided so Charlotte gives birth, lives with her parents, they help with the baby, and she finishes her studies, builds a career, and then does what she wants. Except that then never came. Charlotte, yes, she studied, of course. But the accident happened shortly after she got her degree. Who knows, maybe if she'd stayed alive, she would have found you sooner. She probably would have. Well, Danielle's great-grandmother didn't know who the girl's father was, so she couldn't find you if she wanted to. That's the story. If it wasn't for chance, Danielle would still be without a father. Now, I hope you understand why I left her this much money. She's your daughter. I had to help that little girl, but it wasn't just money, I hope. I think I've given her something much more valuable. I found her a father. I know how you long for a child, a baby of your own. And here you have a teenage daughter. Interesting, with her own opinions and personality. She's great, George, and she needs you very, very much. And you need her. Just do me a favor. Don't make Vanessa the girl's stepmother. She'll make her life a nightmare. Find someone else. A more empathetic and understanding woman. You're worth more than that. And so does Danielle. I believe you're the closest thing to each other. You'll be reunited and live happily ever after. I wish I could be there for you. Love you and kisses. Take care of each other. George finished reading. Only then he noticed that his hands were trembling. As a postscript, Madison had left Danielle's address and a link to a DNA test, which it turned out this amazing woman had managed to conduct secretly from her husband. George had no doubts about the result of that test. A light, fresh breeze blew in from the sea. It was too cold for swimming, but it was a pleasure to walk along the shore. George walked along the sand, holding his daughter's hand. It was hard to get used to, but it felt good to say to someone, "That's my daughter." "George, we've missed so many years. Now we're catching up," he thought. They talked a lot, traveled a lot, talked about everything in the world. George felt absolutely happy, and he knew exactly who he had to thank for that happiness: Madison. Amazing, unique, intelligent, sensitive, kind. Sometimes George thought she was somewhere nearby, looking at him and Danielle and smiling contentedly.